This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Welcome to today's meeting of the Housing Committee. Members of the public may like to follow at London Assembly on social media and use the hashtag London Housing for this meeting. Please may I remind participants to silence your devices. Our main item of business this afternoon is a discussion on leasehold and service charges. As part of our investigation, Londoners who are affected by leasehold charges are also being encouraged to respond to a survey to be launched soon on our website to tell the committee directly about their experience of costs and how they're impacted by them. Before we begin, we have a few short items of business. Can I ask our clerk, Diane Richards, if any apologies have been received?
Thank you, Chair. No apologies for absence have been received today.
Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interests to declare?
Noted and no.
Okay.
I do have a leasehold.
Oh, okay. So can we assume that all of us live in a flat in London and we...
Well, I don't live in a flat. That's why I'm peculiar. I live in a house which is a leasehold. But I thought it's wise to declare that.
Chair, do you want us to declare that?
Well, our addresses and everything else are listed in the register, so I think that's fine.
No, I rent out.
Okay, fine. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I'd like to declare that I do rent out a flat on a leasehold basis to tenants.
Fine. Thank you very much. Anybody else? Great. Can we confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 12th of November 2024? Can we note the completed, closed and outstanding actions arising from the previous meetings? Okay, great. That brings us to our main item of business, leasehold and service charges. Can I please welcome our panel of guests? We have Harry Scoffin, campaigner for free leaseholders, Sue Phillips, who's the founder of Shared Ownership Resource, and Martin Boyd, who's the chair of the Leasehold Advisory Service and chair of trustees at the Leasehold Knowledge Partnership. So welcome to you all. It's a great pleasure to meet you. This is a really hot topic, and we're really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. So I will kick off with the first couple of questions and hand over to my colleagues on the committee. My first question to all of you is, in your opinion, what challenges are London's leaseholders currently facing, and how will the new Leasehold and Freehold Reform Act impact these challenges? So can I start with perhaps Martin? And if you want to tell us a little bit about your organisation for the benefit of those people at home, that would be really helpful as well.
Yeah, sure. I'm Martin Boyd. As you said, I'm chair of trustees for the Leasehold Knowledge Partnership. We've been campaigning for leasehold reform for a very long time. I've met a number of you in previous iterations, and we helped in the 2012 report that the GLA produced, where you also looked at service charge problems. Last year, in November, the government asked me to take over as chair of the Leasehold Advisory Service, with the aim of radically reforming the organisation so it has more impact for consumers. So between my various hats, we have been pushing for some of the changes that are coming forward. First in the 22 bill, which removed ground rents on new flats and the extended part of any lease, and then with all the reforms in the 24 bill. So this afternoon I'm sometimes going to be able to answer you with my LKP hat on, sometimes as lease, sometimes I will add my third hat, which is that I am chair of a large RMC site in West London, and we have been through all of the trials and tribulations that followed on from the building safety crisis, and trying to keep control of service charges in a period of undue inflation. So in terms of answering your questions, the 2024 bill was very important because it started to lay the grounds for fundamental reform. Unfortunately, we had an early election called, so some of the amendments that may have come forward later on in the bill didn't make it into the legislation. At the moment, the government is beginning to implement the secondary legislation that supports the bill, and of course that's the really important elements that actually make it work. Perhaps the most important bits within the existing leasehold system, rather than the elements of where we're going to change to in the future, is changing the balance of power within the Tribunal. At the moment, it's an utterly one-sided and unfair system where leaseholders have no right to any of their costs, even when their landlord has been utterly egregious in their behaviour. We should now move, when the secondary legislation comes into force, to a much more balanced environment. The other one is what many people will see as a very dull and uninteresting part of the bill, but I think it's actually massively important, and that's the standardised provision of accounting information. At the moment, you have no means to compare your service charges with any other site in the country. Once we have standard information, it becomes a lot easier for people to know that they are likely to being overcharged, or that their costs might be high on a particular item, but that may be what everyone else is paying. So that'll do, I think, as a start from me.
No, that's really excellent. I will come back to what you think is missing from the bill that would impact Londoners. We'll come back to that later. But Sue, if you want to answer that question as well.
Hold on.
Yes, I'm the founder of Shared Ownership Resources, which is a project that was set up to advocate for the best interest of shared owners. The project publishes information and advice for shared owners in collaboration with experts. It publishes shared owner case studies and campaigns against mis-selling and other poor practices. In relation to the Leaseholding Reform Act, the big question is whether shared owners will benefit to the same degree as other leaseholders from the provisions of that bill. Matthew Pennycook's recent statement makes it clear that there's an issue around complex ownership structures which may get in the way of shared owners benefiting from lease extension provisions in the same way as other leaseholders. So there's a question there still to be resolved. Greater transparency is welcome, but I think it's worth making the point that greater transparency doesn't in and of itself necessarily lead to greater affordability. So again, that's something I'm sure we'll come back to, the question of affordability for shared owners.
And then Harry, finally.
Lovely, thanks for having me. So I'm founder of Free Leaseholders. We set up the campaign with a bit of frustration because obviously I remember I was at the old City Hall 4 years ago. Well, I think it was Umesh Desai, brilliant inquiry, but nothing changed. And we were promised from the last government that there'd be reforms in the third session of Parliament. And in the end, that one got lobbied out. And we set up this campaign because we knew we had to hold the feet of politicians to the fire, whoever is in power. And you've got to also speak in the language of those in power. So we knew it wasn't going to happen from the Conservatives. And we set up a last-ditch campaign to force it into the King's Speech. That was achieved. With Labour, unfortunately, we can speak all about the policies all we like. This is a political issue. And it's a cost of living emergency for millions of households, not just in London, across England and Wales. And our view is that the real experts are the ones that live in these flats that have to pay for them. And those are the people that should be driving the reforms. Because the reality is, successive governments have reformed leasehold, they've led to dead ends, they've created new loopholes, more exclusions, and more power to landlords. And we'll get on to the deficiencies of the 2024 Act, because there are a number that were slipped through, and unfortunately it was left to people like Lord Bailey, but also the Telegraph newspaper, bizarrely, to pick up on those things, such as decriminalisation of service charge abuse. But for us, we've got to look at it from first principles. Do we give control to the people that are paying for these homes and these buildings, or do we leave third-party freeholders and landlords to control the homes? And for us, it means getting rid of the system. It's not more tinkering. And that means also going beyond the Law Commission reports of 4 years ago. And I think the really key point here is we're not going to blame the Mayor of London. He's not got a huge amount of power on this one, but he can lobby, he can advocate for the interests of millions of Londoners and beyond on this issue with central government. Now his own party is in power. And the announcement that was slipped out as a parliamentary written statement a few weeks ago, hoping you and journalists wouldn't pick up on it, is not good enough. Labour promised change at the election. They promised to move quickly in the King's Speech. We're now being told it's a 4 to 5 year commitment. Our supporters cannot wait 4 to 5 more years. These are people that are going on beta blockers, antidepressants, suicidal ideation, because the service charges are getting out of control. So that's what we just say, that we need a bit of urgency, the same urgency we see on other issues, like assisted dying, for example. That's a complicated one. But leasehold, getting rid of it, was promised in the Labour manifesto. So it is a political issue. As much as we want to make it about technical and policy, this is about decisions being made by number 10 in the Treasury.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm just going to reflect some of the things back to you that you have said, all three of you. You can answer in any way you want to. So Harry, you mentioned that this is a political issue and talked about the statement that was slipped out, WMS. It'd be good to kind of expand on that, because I would appreciate your take on that. I did see you on BBC News at some stage recently talking, I think, about that, but it'd be helpful to understand. But also, Martin and Sue, you've in different ways reflected the fact that there is a lot of stuff missing from what is coming forward. So I would like to know what is missing, or what are the amendments that have been dropped that maybe would impact Londoners positively, and just what more you want to see more of in the upcoming bill, And I know you said that you'd like something before Christmas, which would be ideal, but in terms of timeline, kind of where we would be with kind of making those things happen. So perhaps let's start with Harry and then work back the other way.
We just want to go back to the King's Speech commitments of the government. They said that they're going to move quickly on the Leasehold and Freehold Reform Act 2024 that was passed in the wash-up, partly because Labour supported it, which was fantastic because it wasn't going to happen. Number 10 under Rishi Sunak didn't want the bill to happen, and there was a last-ditch attempt to get it onto the statute books. They've now come out with a statement saying there's a number of serious flaws that was not flagged to them in July when they took power, which is bizarre because they obviously said quickly. And then beyond that, they promised in this parliamentary session, 24-25, that there'd be a draft leasehold and commonhold reform bill for pre-legislative scrutiny. Now we're being told that's being opened up again with a commonhold white paper the beginning of next year, and that we won't get the draft bill until the end of next year. Now, if you actually look into the detail of what Labour have promised, it's reheating Law Commission reports from 4 years ago, which they themselves were subject to years of research and consultation. And I remember because I've got the scars on my back for participating on those ones. So the question is, it's all about prioritisation, because as we saw with the Tories, we were going to get it in the third session. It got lobbied out by very powerful vested interests. We obviously couldn't control for Liz Truss, bless her heart, blew up the economy, all the rest of it. Then obviously on the fifth session, we get a rather modest bill. And the reality is, obviously I've been told there's no parliamentary immunity here, so I've got to be careful not naming individuals. But obviously if you look into the media, there are some big lobbying interests, including close to the Labour Party, that are working for big freeholders. And we've got lots of grassroots campaigners and supporters, some of them that come from communications backgrounds. And they said, if you want to get rid of something on ground rent, what you do is you don't just get rid of that policy, you punt the whole bill to the end of the Parliament. That's exactly what's happening. So we've got to be very careful on that. But for the 2024 Act, they've committed to bringing into force just 2 policies before next summer. One of which is, at the moment, if you want to extend your lease or buy the freehold, if you've just bought the property, you can't do that for the first 2 years. It was an unfair rule. That's going to be scrapped in January. And then there's a set of reforms to right to manage. Right to manage is a great halfway house before you get to buying your freehold or getting to commonhold, because it gives you some element of control and you get out from under the hold of the landlord, which is good. I think most people would support it. They're going to reform that. And it was something as simple as changing a number in a 2002 Act from Labour, changing it from 25% to 50% in mixed-use buildings. Because at the moment, if you've got too much commercial floor space, you're completely locked into a landlord. You have no ability to remove the managing agent. That's going to change. But they said that they've just found out that there's a material error in that one, and they have to fix that using secondary powers. So they're now committing to fixing that in spring. But most of the other changes, they're now saying, there's no definites as to when that will come into force. The really important context is the government are currently being sued under the Human Rights Act and the European Convention of Human Rights, and this is where the politics comes in, by the big freeholders, because they're claiming it's breach of their human rights. The Michael Gove Act, which obviously there's an argument that it doesn't go far enough. And my view, and the view of our supporters, is that the government are running scared of the big freeholders, and that they're using this legal case in the new year in the High Court to punt the whole agenda through, because they're worried about the legal implications. And I think that's really important, that we need more action. And there's a very good viral thread on Twitter by an independent activist who we do work with, Martin Keegan, and he actually looked into the statement. There are lots of really good policies in the 2024 Act, but MHCLG did not commit to bringing any of them into force. They didn't even mention them. So one really good policy, which sounds tinkering for a lot of people, but it will be the difference between people selling their property and not, is capping the management pack fee, because at the moment freeholders can basically charge whatever they like in a way, unless you want to go to tribunal and be a serial litigator. The last government promised that would be capped to £250 plus VAT, and then obviously with inflation there would be a secondary instrument to change it. MHCLG haven't committed to bring that into force. They've also not committed to bringing in leasebacks. Leasebacks will reduce the cost of buying out the freeholder, or for mixed-use buildings, and beyond that, because you have to get 50% of a building, a lot of people can't afford to pay for the other neighbours that can't participate. So leasebacks will be a winner. But again, the government haven't committed on that. And that doesn't need the valuation changes which are being sued over by the big freeholders. So there's definitely politics that's going on here. So I think, yeah, that's our message to your committee today is don't get bogged down in the technical. Why is this not being prioritised?
Okay. Thank you very much. Sue.
Currently, shared owners don't have a statutory right to lease extension, unlike other leaseholders, so it's welcome that the bill is seeking to address that. I understand there's a technical issue at the moment around the often very complex ownership arrangements you have in shared ownership developments, where the housing association may not be the freeholder, they may be a head lessee, they may be a sub-lessee with no statutory right to lease extension themselves. And my understanding is that this is a technical issue and that that government is seeking a legal mechanism to ensure that shared owners don't fail to have the same statutory right to lease extension as other leaseholders. So that's welcome, and I look forward to clarification on how that will be implemented. However, there are issues over and beyond that statutory right when you're looking at the affordability context. So historically, the model lease for shared ownership has been for a 99-year lease. And oftentimes, shared owners have subsequently realised that other leaseholders or people who are purchasing flats on the open market were actually getting 125-year leases or 250-year leases. So they're encountering, in many cases, the problem of lease extension earlier than other leaseholders. So in terms of any new right to lease extension, they have, if you like, a handicap that their lease is likely to have been run down more than other leaseholders. So even if they have a statutory right to lease extension, there's a question of whether any benefits of the new Act will be, in terms of how the premium is calculated or the removal of marriage value, will be counteracted by the fact that particularly legacy shared owners may have leases with 80, 70, 60, 50 years remaining, so that the affordability may be still out of reach, even with the implementation of the new Act. An important part of the context for this is that a number of shared owners expressed a view that they were missold those short leases. They weren't informed about the implications about the 80-year threshold, about the costs of letting a lease run below 80 years. And there's a moral case, I think, to be made that if they were missold those short leases, that any new right needs to be affordable to take up in practice in the context of the Affordable Home Promise. So there are issues to consider over and beyond sort of finding a legal mechanism to make statutory lease extension available to shared owners in a way that it isn't at the moment. I touched in responding to the previous question on transparency and affordability. Transparency is key for informed decision making at the point of purchase in terms of the decision whether or not to go into the purchase of a shared ownership home. And then, of course, it's important after that purchase in terms of understanding the nature of charges for repairs and maintenance and insurance and so on and so forth. This is an issue of particular relevance to shared owners who are responsible at present for 100% of the costs, regardless of the size of their share. And under the new model, their share may be as low as 10%. So again, we need to be looking at transparency in the context of the question of the fairness of the liability for 100% of repairs and maintenance costs.
Thank you. Before I come to you, Martin, what would happen to a shared owner if they get to below that threat? What happens to their house? Does it get repossessed? Who owns it after that if their lease is run down? You talked about kind of falling below a threshold. I think the point I'm making is not so much about what happens when you get to 99 or 125 years, because it probably won't be the original shared owner at that point. But the point is that it gets more and more expensive to extend a lease the fewer years that are left. And even if you remove marriage value from the calculation of the premium, the fact that shared owners have started off with a shorter lease in the first place means that it may still be more expensive for them, given that the starting point was different, 99 or 125 years rather than 250 years. They're more likely to need to undertake
a lease extension, and it's not clear, because we have a question at the moment about how premiums will be calculated under the new legislation. Because that's not clear, it's also not clear whether shared owners who may have a very low number of years remaining on the lease will find that the new right is affordable to take up in practice.
Okay, thank you. And then finally to Martin, and then Assembly Member Lord Bailey after that.
I'll probably best answer this one with my LKP hat on in case I get accused of criticising the government. Obviously, the most fundamental element missing from the 24 bill was the inclusion of commonhold. It's something that we've all been campaigning for a long time. There is something that could happen now that would help us on the way to commonhold. Following the 22 bill, there is no right to a ground rent on new properties. So there is no legitimate reason for any developer not offering a share of the freehold or an RMC in developments that go up now. That would make transition to commonhold much, much easier when we get that bill come forward. The other really annoying thing that was missing from the bill was forfeiture, and there were several MPs and peers who put proposals forward to remove it. Getting rid of it is more complicated than some people had assumed. You can't just get rid of it. It is still a problem that needs solving in commonhold. You have to get to a position where you can have some form of forced sale. You can't just allow money judgments, particularly on small sites. They would become unviable if someone has got permission not to pay their service charges over a protracted period of time. There are then a whole series of small technical issues that didn't come forward. Inevitably, they will be considered by this government. And shared ownership is particularly one that needed to change because there were some odd limitations in what shared owners can and cannot do. You have no right to extend your lease unless you've staircased to 100%, which seems odd. Other key area that was missing, what is known as leasehold, which applies to mainly houses, so not necessarily that relevant to London. Estate charges. It does actually apply within London. We have a number of leasehold developments that also have estate charges under 106 agreements where it simply isn't fair. My site, we pay for a large bridge that forms part of the Thames Walkway, and we've had the great benefit of having to spend £250,000 of our money to maintain what is a public bridge.
Thank you. Assembly Member Lord Bailey.
I just want to return to Sue's point about transparency. I want to make it very clear, Sue. I used to be a shared owner, so maybe I should declare that. And the question I'm going to ask is me playing devil's advocate from the other side when you talk about the length of the lease and transparency. What would you say to owners who say, but those people signed the contract, they know what was in it? What would you say to that?
Your mic, please.
Sorry. I would say that there's been a lot of publicity around the problems associated with short leases in recent years, so more people are more aware of the problems associated with short leases. But I think historically, given that shared owners are have been, research has shown that they're a demographic who often are relatively less likely to have knowledge and expertise around property issues, to be financially savvy, confident in financial issues, to expect people to understand, to be aware of the existence of the 80-year threshold of marriage value, when those things are not specifically referenced in the materials they were given at the point of sale. Historically, housing associations haven't been clear about the implications. Solicitors haven't. And my understanding is that solicitors have historically seen the issues as being out of the scope of supporting a conveyancing transaction. Solicitors aren't there to advise on the pros and cons of a scheme. They're there to facilitate a conveyancing transaction. So there's been a lot of sort of to and fro with housing associations saying solicitors historically should have told people about these issues, and solicitors saying housing associations should have told shared owners about these issues. The reality is that for whatever reason, historically, there hasn't been the public awareness of the issue of short leases. Shared owners haven't been given that information. It's not clear where they would have found that information if it wasn't conveyed by either the housing association or the solicitor. And many shared owners, myself included, have found about the issues once the 80-year threshold has been breached. I think it's also worth mentioning the ASA ruling on the Keys National Marketing Campaign, which found that it was a breach of the code not to provide material information in relation to leases, and I would argue that that hasn't happened, and it's an onus on the seller to provide material information. Information about a short lease is material information for making an informed transactional decision, and that information has not been available to buyers.
I 1,000,000% agree with you, if only because of my personal experience with shared ownership and the lease and all the rest of that drama. Chair, I wonder if one of our recommendations is we ask for the mayor to provide some of that information on his website and any leases that that the GLA his housing is involved in, because Sue's point, most people who got involved with shared ownership, it was a real life change. They never had any opportunity to own property before. They don't come from a property owning family, so they need an extra duty of care, and the mayor may be able to step in and provide that, at least for some people.
Well, I'm happy for us to add that to the list of issues that we discuss when we get to emerging recommendations point of the scope.
Could I just add that the new model obviously recognises the issues with the short leases. I welcome the reform that means that we're no longer selling 99-year leases, but what we don't want is to have reforms that benefit new buyers but leave legacy shared owners stranded with a short lease that they can't afford to extend, they can't sell. So we need to not lose sight of existing shared owners when we're looking at reforms for shared owners in the future.
Okay, thank you so much. Where were we? Oh, yes. I was going to ask you all one final very brief question and then hand over to Assemblymember Small-Edwards. Whether or not you anticipate a move towards commonhold reducing service charges for leaseholders and shared owners.
Yes, it's this very short answer. It will reduce service charges.
The relationships between shared ownership and the developments in which they sit are often complicated, and I think that there are a number of questions to be raised about whether it's about whether shared owners benefit from reforms to the same degree as leaseholders more generally. At present, what we see that within the same developments, shared owners can face duplicate charges because they're paying fees to their own housing association, to managing agents, to freeholders in whatever form, ground rent, service charges, whatever. So I think there are a number of questions as to whether shared owners will benefit to the same degree, and I think it's important to look at the detail in that respect.
Thank you. And then finally, Harry.
Absolutely. So you'd be getting rid of a lot of kickbacks to freeholders and related companies because you've got the alignment of interest that you don't have in leasehold, because obviously the people paying the bills are the ones controlling the bills, and they're the ones appointing the service provider. So you are a bit like Alan Sugar on The Apprentice. If someone's ripping you off, you say you're fired. And that's a much better system, and it's what they have in Scotland and the rest of the world. So it's always shocks me when we talk about leasehold and we obsess about leasehold, about reforming it. Actually, we're the odd ones out in the world. We need to get with the programme finally. After, I think it's been over 30 years. Margaret Thatcher was pushing commonhold in 1987. I mean, come on here, guys. Even Which, I think some years ago, found that there was at least £700 million in service charge overcharging. Hamptons, the estate agency last year came out that England's flat leaseholders were paying £7.6 billion in service charge. The Commons Housing Select Committee in Parliament found no evidence to say that third-party freeholders provided any better level of service or any kind of cost savings. And even a group from the London School of Economics last year also found no evidence that they provide, economies of scale. The only economies of scale that's happening is economies of rip-off, because freeholders are using related companies. A big one recently is buildings insurance commissions. The FCA has done an inquiry into that. They found about nearly 80 million or so in 3 years just going to freeholders and managing agents. And that's on one line item of a service charge budget. So down the road from me, it's a very famous case. I won't mention the name of the development, but in 10 years, there was overcharging of £1.6 million. And that was a freeholder-related company. And the leaseholders tried to challenge it originally. You know what the First Tier Tribunal turned around and said? They said, we're not giving you disclosure, it's a fishing expedition. 4 years later, they found out 1.6 million, it then obviously got appealed, 1.1 million was ruled not payable. But if the leaseholders hadn't challenged it and they hadn't become the sub-postmasters and spent 4 years of their life in that tribunal, they would have never known. I think really important point, in the 2024 Act, there's a really damaging policy. The government said everything's complicated except for this one policy. It's really important. The only people that have picked up on it is the insurance press. What they're doing is rebadging commissions as transparent fees. You've just seen the car finance case. So what's happening here is we've got policy capture. Basically, the freeholders and the government are getting ahead of that. There's a big class action now on buildings insurance commissions and leasehold. So as long as this kickback is disclosed, it will be almost impossible to challenge. And that is undermining common law protections, because at the moment, if you have a landlord, they have a fiduciary duty to you, the tenant, not to make secret profits from monies held on trust. But what the government are doing, they're turning around and saying, actually, you can make money from the insurance as a permitted insurance fee. So that's really damaging. And obviously the whole media don't understand it. A lot of policy people in the area don't really want to mention it because they're linked to the government. We're the only people talking about this issue. And it's a big, big thing. If it was in car finance, there'd have been riots already. But because it's in leasehold land, no one's talking about it. And it's a really big issue because they've punted LAFRA, the 2024 Act, into the long grass, and they've punted this commonhold bill. But they find time to entrench a commission scheme for freeholders. So that's a really important issue for Londoners and across the country in leasehold.
Okay, thank you. And then Martin, and then we'll come to you, Assembly Member Swallow.
Yeah, service charge is a really, really difficult issue because there are some service charges which people believe are too high, where unfortunately there isn't a lot of option. Some things on large buildings cost an awful lot of money. Problem at the moment is it's almost impossible to find out where you're genuinely being overcharged and where you may not have understood. But the benefit of commonhold is much bigger than reducing service charges. They become a relatively unimportant thing at the end of the day, because the benefit you get from commonhold is you have a collective interest in ensuring the value of your homes and adding to the value of your homes. So you have an active incentive to invest in your building. In leasehold world, where you've got a third-party landlord, their only interest is in making a profit from you. So I think long term, the real benefit we get out of commonhold is that we will end up with better quality homes. There is some argument from the supply side of the sector that says, well, really, resident-run blocks don't actually charge very much less than third-party freeholder-run block. Not sure that the evidence is that robust on that at all, and there is some very clear evidence that some third-party landlords are making huge profits out of their leaseholders and creating an awful system for them.
Okay, thank you. Assembly Member Small Edwards.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, everyone. It's good to see you all here. My question is to Sue, and I just wanted to ask you what you think are the unique challenges that face shared owners in particular, unique challenges that faced shared owners when it comes to leasehold costs and service charges?
A lot of people will say that the problems that shared owners face are the same problems that leaseholders face more generally. And I think the problem with that argument is that shared owners come into the scheme on the promise that it's an affordable home scheme and that it's a pathway to full home ownership. So straight away we have to always bear that context in mind and then ask, is it those things? And if not, what's getting in the way of that? Now, looking specifically at service charges, actually, can I look at total housing costs and then service charges within that? So shared owners are obliged to buy the maximum share that they can afford. That's a given in the scheme. And although the initial affordability assessment process has changed recently, what's been used generally is the idea that in London, that people shouldn't be spending more than 40% of their income on their household costs under this scheme. So they come in with this sort of 40% maximum threshold. And I want to look at the logic of the scheme, and then I want to look at the data. So in terms of the logic, rents are set to increase annually above inflation, slightly above inflation, but obviously that's compounding over the years. Rents increase faster than inflation. Service charge, there's a lot of evidence that service charges do rise faster than inflation. The University of York has done research on this. The Property Institute has published a view that service charges do increase rapidly and faster than inflation. Household incomes tend not to increase as fast. So the logic of that is that people are probably going to end up paying more than 40% of their net income in their total housing costs. So moving to the data, I mean, I say over and over again there's a paucity of data, which makes it very hard to answer questions like this, you know, what is actually happening. However, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation has done some preliminary analysis on this issue, and what they've found is that around 1 in 10 shared ownership households are spending more than 40% of their net income on housing costs. And by housing costs, what they mean is the rent, the mortgage interest, ground rent where applicable, building insurance where applicable, and service charges. Now, that's actually an underestimation per their own analysis because, that calculation doesn't include the mortgage principal. So if you put that in there, it's going to be more than 1 in 10 shared owners. Also, you're always looking backwards when you do analysis. So their analysis is based on a 3-year average. They've used a 3-year average because the numbers are quite small for data analysis purposes. So for robustness, they've used a 3-year average of 2021 to 22 to 23. But since then, mortgage rates have gone up. So again, the numbers are probably going to be higher than the 1 in 10 when you take into account mortgage interest rates going up and the fact that people are paying mortgage principal that is coming out of their net incomes. So the data shows that people are paying more than 40%. Now, the other point I want to make about that is that you've got a really wide range of households coming into shared ownership. You've got the £90,000 in London upper income threshold. Now, if someone's coming in as an individual with a £90,000 salary, to a lot of people, that looks like somebody fairly affluent. So you've got the question not just of what percentage of their incomes has been spent on housing costs, but what's their residual income? How much do they have left after their housing costs for their basic needs? And there's going to be a really wide range of households within the shared ownership scheme, some of whom may have quite a lot of income left after housing costs, and people at the lower end, the people at whom probably it's really targeted, the people who are most in need of a secure, affordable home, may actually be the people who've got least residual income left. So I think it's important to move away from the sort of the binary arguments about is it a great product or is it a scam, and to instead be looking at which are the demographics that are finding they're spending more than 40% of their net income on housing costs, and what's the impact of that for those households. And without having that information, it's very hard to know whether the scheme is delivering value for money, whether it's targeted at the people in most need of affordable housing, whether it's targeted at households for whom actually it may have adverse outcomes. So we need to be trying to drill down into this question of who's paying more than 40% and does it matter? I mean, obviously it matters, but it's like, who does it matter most for? Is this scheme actually having... Is the scheme working for the households that are most in need of it, or is it benefiting the people who actually are least in need?
Thank you very much. And given what you've articulated there, do you think shared ownership should be considered affordable housing tenure in London currently?
I think that affordability is viewed very differently by providers and entrants to the scheme. So government and providers tend to define affordability in relation to the affordability of the mortgage deposit and the costs in the first few years, which I think was a dogs for dinner approach, really, because when you buy a home, you need it to stay affordable. In fact, can I just quote from a case study on my website, because I think this really summarises the issue. So it's our published case studies. One of those case studies made the following comment. What's the point of affordability testing? I had to pass an affordability test with the Housing Association initially to see if I could afford to pay for the share of the flat and the associated costs. But now, nobody cares if I can still afford it. And I think that's another the issue, that shared owners are taking a long-term perspective on this. If you come into it expecting it to be affordable, and then within 2, 3, 5 years, suddenly it's not affordable, and possibly, even though you can't afford the costs, you may find that you don't have a viable exit route, because it may be that those high service charges and other costs actually make it difficult to sell, either because it can be difficult to sell for several reasons. I mean, one is that the upper threshold is fixed, but if the value of your property goes up, then the people who simultaneously fall within the eligibility criteria, the upper threshold of 90,000, but also can involve the costs that have risen since you bought your share, that creates a smaller pool of potential buyers. So that's one issue. It may be difficult to sell that share if the costs of that property have gone up. The other issue is that if service charges and other costs have gone up too much, it may be an unattractive proposition for a lender, and a potential buyer may find it hard to access a mortgage. So I feel like I've gone slightly off topic. Could you just bring me back to the actual question? So have I answered the question, or was there anything else you wanted to know?
Yeah, I think you have, but the question was, do you think it's currently affordable?
Do I think it's affordable? I think it's affordable for some people. I think it's very far from affordable and very problematic for other people, and we need a better understanding of who it's affordable for and who it's not affordable for. So, A, we can target it where it's needed and not target it where it's going to have adverse outcomes, and also to make sure that it's providing value for money for the public purse in terms of targeting affordable housing where it's most needed.
Yeah, and I represent a central London constituency, and I think also geographically, I think affordability probably varies somewhat as well.
Hugely, around the country and within London, I'm sure.
You just mentioned you do a lot of case studies. Do you find there's many issues with staircasing?
When I say do a lot of case studies, I think we need data on a scale that I can't begin to provide that. But we do have that data. We know that the rates of staircasing are very low. We also know that they're overestimated, because historically what's being conflated is shared owners who staircase to 100% in a home they continue living in at that point, and people who've undertaken a simultaneous sale and staircasing transaction in order to be able to sell. And there's been some very interesting research on staircasing which speculates that 100% staircasing, if it takes the form of a back-to-back sale, a simultaneous sale and staircasing transaction, can actually be an indicator of unaffordability rather than affordability. It's welcome that the statistics going forward are going to separate out those two forms of staircasing. However, it does make it difficult to sort of run comparisons between what's happened historically and what happens now. But coming back to your question, rates of staircasing per the data that's available are very low. I think there are a number of reasons for that. Research shows that housing costs tend to rise, the value of property tends to rise faster than income, so staircasing under the current market value model for staircasing can be pushed out of reach. Another issue, coming back to service charges, the Levelling Up Housing and Community Committee in their inquiry into shared ownership found that the fact that service charges can increase rapidly and unexpectedly can in itself push staircasing out of reach, because your income's going towards paying those charges, which makes it harder to save not just for the cost of purchasing the share, but all the associated costs. In a shared ownership scheme, you're paying valuation fees over and over again, you're paying legal fees over and over again, you're buying your home in a series of transactions which have incidental costs as well as the sort of the market value premium. So there's an interrelationship between staircasing and service charges. Could I make one final point?
Yes, and then I'll move on to the next person.
I think there's an issue around valuation as well. So I've recently been made aware of a case where a shared owner was given permission to appoint a RICS valuer, but the housing association then disputed that valuation and wanted to appoint its own valuer. And what the outcome is in that situation is it's likely the housing association will be looking for the higher valuation, but the higher valuation isn't acceptable to that person's mortgage lender. It pushes affordability out of reach. And I think valuations are something that come up. This is something that comes up a lot. I've got an article on valuations on the Shared Ownership Resources website. It's been in the top 5 articles all year. Everyone is very interested in valuations because it's such a key issue. If you're looking to understand whether you're paying a fair price for your initial share, if you're looking to understand whether you're paying a fair price to staircase, if you're looking at whether the gain on sale you're likely to get is going to be reasonable, it all comes back to the RICS valuations, and it can be very, very contested. And it's an area where it's very difficult for... there's not clear guidance. If there's a conflict of interest where the housing associations are given the highest valuation, but that pushes staircasing out of reach for the shared owner, at the moment it's very unclear what is the preferred policy outcome there, the staircasing to 100% for the shared owner or the housing association getting the most return it can on that transaction. It's definitely an area that needs to be looked at more closely.
I'm quite keen that we move us on to the next round of questions. Is there something related specifically to shared ownership that you'd like to comment on? And then I will move us on. So if you won't mind to be brief.
I'll be very quick. 3 very quick points. As Pete Apps made clear when he gave evidence to the APPG on leasehold and commonhold reform, your affordability test is when you may just have married and both incomes are counted, and then you go and have babies, and suddenly what was affordable becomes very, very marginal. There is no sort of reset on that. Other major point, you own 25% of your property, and quite legitimately, you should be paying 100% of the service charge for your electricity, communal electricity and things like that. But you're paying for 100% of the roof repairs. You will then pay an additional price for staircasing because your property is more valuable because you've paid for the new roof. So you paid twice for that. Also, we have some awful issues arising out of the building safety crisis where, again, shared ownership leaseholders were advised at various points they might have to pay for all of the remediation. Most of that has now abated. There are, however, because of the GLA rules, severe limitations on people being able to sublet shared ownership flats. And after 7 years, a number of people have had to move homes to get on with their careers. There are some people who no longer even live in the country. But you have to mainly sublet, if you're allowed to sublet, at a loss. So it becomes even less affordable.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just quickly, one very quick point on shared ownership?
We are really behind on
There's
time.
a real retrograde move in the 2024 Act, which is now banning shared owners from buying the freehold unless they staircase to 100%. Why that's important is that if you are in a block where shared owners are pepper potted around, you're stuffing the private flat leaseholders, because they will not necessarily be able to get the money and the buy-in, because you've got shared owners now that the government have banned from buying the freehold. So that's a big issue, because all these exclusionary qualifying criteria, it catches up with private leaseholders too. So for a lot of these blocks, we're like Siamese twins. We're connected to the shared owners. So I think the thing is, I think Sue's position is right, is get them up to the same rights as private leaseholders, and then we can move forward for commonhold together, because otherwise it's going to be very damaging, and that's what's happening at the moment. Shared ownership's being almost pulling away from where we're going on leasehold reform. So I think that's a really important point.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Assembly Member Lord Bailey.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. I'm going to start with Martin, with this question, Martin. Do leaseholders in buildings with the right to manage or residence management companies pay less in service charges?
I think I sort of said yes as a one-word answer earlier. I brought you in to look at later the service charges at my site, because I asked property managers to give me the figures over the last 10 years. Although our service charges have gone up, if we count back inflation, we are almost exactly where we were in 2015. Right. It is very few sites with third-party landlords that will be in that position. And then going on to my point earlier about commonhold and the fact that if you are part of the building ownership, you have a vested interest in making sure you add to the value. We have, over that 10-year period, increased our reserves from, we were sitting at £671,000. We are currently sitting at something like 2.3 million. So we're setting a lot of money aside to invest in keeping the building in good condition.
And would that level of, maybe not level of reserves, that's unfair, would that tactic around reserves, is that something you commonly see with a third party?
No, the third-party landlord you very often see, particularly on new build sites, massive underinvestment in the reserve account to look after the building in the long term. It's a good way to keep the service charges down artificially. So you have to, when you look at service charges, you really have to look at the two elements separately. You know, we could have a zero service charge at our site next year if we took all the money out of the reserves.
But of course, if you had a problem in the future,
you then got a massive problem going forward. So you have to be very careful in looking at service charge and understanding them in a holistic way as well. But yes, if you are the owners of the building, you have a keen interest in keeping your costs down because you're paying the money, and you have a keen interest in investing in your building to make sure you add to the value of your homes.
Thank you. Harry, is there any other challenges that resident management companies face or that residents have brought in their own manager? Is there any particular issues they face?
Well, I think you've just got to make sure that there's good governance. You know, you've got the Articles of Association. The fact is, the sector side will always say residents will fall out like rats in a sack. That is a democratic system. Yeah, there'll be tensions in any communal setup. The reality is, so many surveys have shown you've got much higher levels of resident or leaseholder satisfaction under resident management companies or right to manage. So it seems like a no-brainer, and we're finding with our supporters, on average, about 20% saving if they do right to manage. We've even seen 35% savings, because what they also do when they're not in London, I know we're here in London today, they go for local contractors. You know, guys in Swindon are not getting people coming in from the capital. So that is a great thing. And I think even in London, people can go for super local contractors. You've just got democratic oversight, which you just don't have with a third-party landlord. But I think there is an element of, there's a big thing, and maybe we'll come on to it next, is there's this big push to get managing agents regulated. What we say to that is leaseholders need liberation before any more regulation, because we need to learn from the Building Safety Regulator and the Building Safety Act. That was supposed to protect the leaseholders. It's basically surcharged service charges. There's been work by Endar Cladding Scandal, The Telegraph, saying actually all it's done is increased compliance costs, which then get dumped onto our service charge. And obviously you know why they're pushing for regulator of managing agents. It's to stop a market from emerging. where obviously there'll be competition. Because at the moment, we don't have a market. The freeholders are choosing the managing agents, and they're only there to extract as much money as possible out of the buildings, and the managing agents are not incentivised to provide a good service because their clients.
So you're saying, why would a regulator stop the formation of a market? Tell us.
Because there'll be barriers to entry that will be emerging. New companies that want to set up, maybe ethical, maybe set up by leaseholders themselves, they're going to have reams and reams of stuff to comply with. And I'm speaking to leaseholders that are already starting to set up their own managing agencies.
What would you say to someone who said managing a building is complicated, expensive, has great liability around fire safety for one thing? What would you say to someone who said we do need someone to make sure these management companies actually understand what they're doing? Because this for some people could be financial ruin or could mean death. Surely a regulator would help that process.
The concern is that you run into regulation, you then bring up massive new costs on leaseholders. It kills flat living in this country, which is what's happening in the Building Safety Act. But beyond that, you're basically saying you're not trusting consumers to appoint their own managing agent. And for that, it's really important because look at other regulators. Many of them, they're ineffective or they're captured. I'm giving an example here, the Financial Conduct Authority. I wrote a piece about their situation on building insurance commissions. They were the FSA back in 2005. They did an internal review on leasehold building insurance commissions. They never went any further. They thought it was a potential emerging scandal. It then took Michael Gove to put a gun to their heads to say, inquire, investigate. Then they finally came out. That was 20 plus years later. I think that's a real concern. You look at other jurisdictions in the world, they don't have full-blown statutory regulation of block managers. Even Australia, which obviously pioneered commonhold with strata title, speaking to people over there in New South Wales, they laugh at the idea that the regulator is a magic bullet. They've just started to strip one managing agent owner of a licence. Do we believe, as talented as civil servants are, should civil servants and bureaucrats be the ones deciding who are good managing agents? And the reality is all the regulation in the world is not necessarily going to stop bad behaviour, and you've got to let the market weed out the bad performers, because at the moment there isn't a market. I think that's really important. A lot of leaseholders you speak to, they're so unhappy with a lot of the managing agents out there, they're now setting up their own managing agencies. Then you ask them, do you think Lord Best would work, that regulatory scheme that everyone's pushing? They laugh. They say, if the government hasn't actually got rid of leasehold, good luck policing cowboys. And actually it's better for the market to work its way through. Then obviously if there are massive scandals of managing agents in 3 to 5 years from now, then we look at regulating managing agents. Don't do it in tandem, because it's being used as an excuse to draw this out, and all the managing agents that do not work for paying leaseholders want to be accountable to a regulator, not to the residents. So that is a really big issue, because what we're going to see is capture of the regulator, or a regulator that is not going to enforce things.
Okay.
Is there a final brief?
No, my final briefing is to say back to you, Chair.
Oh, okay, wonderful. Assembly Member Cooper, please.
Thank you. I think
Chair,
you...
I indicated on...
Okay. I think you've touched on this a fair amount, but originally I was supposed to be asking you what is missing in terms of data collection around service charges, and will the changes in the Leasehold and Freehold Reform Act give us the transparency that we need? And that's to you, Martin. Is there anything you want to add to what you've already said?
Oh, a lot, I'm afraid, because it's data. I was in a meeting this morning and we were discussing just this and how we get effective data into the market. At the moment, there is no system to help inform consumers, and we have to get one in place as part of the 24 Act. We have to get it in place as part of the commonhold system, because unless you have a valid means of knowing what the comparators are for the work that you need done on your site, you don't have any easy means of testing whether the three suppliers you happen to have chosen are likely to be giving you a good price or not. So there is a lot of work to do in that area.
So specifically data about what?
I'll keep going for a long time on this one unless you're careful. Right, the most important information is accounting information. You also need more relevant information on your lease. An awful lot of leaseholders have got no idea what the provisions of their lease actually say, and that is utterly, utterly ridiculous. The whole problem goes away once we get to commonhold, because we have a standard system. But whilst we've still got leasehold, we need that. There is currently a dearth of information about short leases available to consumers. An awful lot of people allow their lease to fall under 80 years without anyone ever bothering to tell them, because the sooner you can get your lease under 80 years as a landlord, the sooner you can start making extra money when you extend the lease. So that is something we need to do, and I will put my lease hat on for that one and say that is something that has to happen.
Okay, well, I seem to remember sitting not here in the old place and talking about why don't we just get commonhold done,
yes,
using the expression that the then Prime Minister was using about Brexit. But we clearly haven't moved quickly enough on that. Is there anything that you would like to add to what Martin has just said? Harry, coming to Harry.
Yeah, I'm more dubious about the 2024 Act in terms of providing that transparency. There was a big row that blew up just after the Act had passed, sadly. It had basically gone past the eyes of lawyers, or maybe the ones for the freeholders kept quiet for a reason. But basically what's happened is that they've decriminalised the withholding of service charge information. Now, this is a right that goes back to the 1980s. And when it got obviously picked up, there was a huge amount of backlash, including from someone sitting on this panel here. And the argument is that when you've got very powerful landlords, you've got to get the incentives right. You don't give them some civil penalties. In a tribunal system, they manipulate every week. Some of these same landlords are in and out at the same time, every week, different blocks. You don't decriminalise something. And the argument is...
OK, so you're kind of answering my next question, which I'd like you to roll up into what you're saying now, which is how common are unreasonable service charges then?
Endemic. And the reality is that if every leaseholder wanted to litigate on this, they'd be queuing around the whole British Isles. The reality is that that isn't going to happen. And I think the way the government looks at it, successive governments, is that, oh, you've got all these lovely rights, go and enforce them. People will then spend years litigating. People don't realise in government, I don't think, that people don't want to fetishise going to court or tribunal. It's a very stressful process, and I have to admit, anyone that works on leasehold reform, there should be a requirement for them to sit through some of these tribunal hearings. It's a really important point. You go to these tribunal hearings. There was one a few weeks ago.
I'm going to stop you there, though, because we are quite kind of pressed for time. We've got a lot of questions. We're only on about question 4 or 5 out of 20. Can I just start? I'm going to ask Martin, would you agree with Harry that unreasonable service charges are literally endemic across the board?
Yeah, I think the most egregious of it actually occurs in the social sector as well.
OK, so also in the social sector. The other point I just want to press you both on, and I will come back to you, Carrie, and you can pick up where you were, which is, to what extent do you think these unreasonable costs are due to negligence, or do you think they're due to deliberate overcharging? And I'll start with Martin, and then I'll come to Harry.
With my LK...
Put on any of your hats that you wish.
Definitely LKP on this one, okay. I feel. The general assumption is within the social sector it is a lack of competence. Within the private sector, it is far more likely to be cynical and intentional.
OK. And would you sort of broadly speaking agree with that, Harry? It's negligence or deliberate overcharging?
For the private sector, it's systemic, basically. It is about making sure you can extract as much income from the hapless tenants as you can possibly do, and hope that they won't go to tribunal. And most people don't, because they've got lives, they've got jobs, they've got stresses, and that's what landlords rely on. And I think the decriminalisation point is so important. until this act, and if maybe Labour will not switch this provision on, but we had a right to go to and do a criminal private prosecution. And that actually worked. I won't mention the developer. It's a big London developer, and they're refusing to hand over the invoices. And a very talented leaseholder, she went to the magistrates' court, and they were going to get a criminal, record. That's a big thing reputationally, and they gave over the invoices. And this policy that they've now decriminalised, potentially if that comes into force, there was no consultation or debate on it. And when it was raised, there was a huge backlash from various stakeholders. And it was just bizarre. If you've had something on the statute book since the 1980s, because the argument is, I've got to give them the other side a bit of credit there. They say, well, it wasn't effective. Then you make it effective. You don't remove a criminal sanction. It's like saying, because no one's been prosecuted yet for selling peerages in the House of Lords, we should decriminalise it. No, make it work. And I think that's the key thing. And I don't think we're going to get real transparency on service charges until these freeholders have the fear of God in them, and they won't with civil remedies. I really don't believe civil remedies will work.
OK, so I think that's a fairly strong message there about deliberate overcharging from everybody. Thanks very much. I'm going to hand back to the chair.
Assembly Member Bath, please.
I'm with you on the service charge things. I found that when I ask for how much service charges am I paying? It's like I'm speaking Martian. They just don't understand the question, which is, and I've never come up with a language which explains to them what I'm asking for. They just don't get it. I don't understand why. I don't understand why. I never will. We talked a lot about conversions to commonhold. And the Law Commission report, 121 recommendations, mostly about conversion, I think. But I want to talk about new commonhold. What are the barriers to providing new commonhold in London?
Sorry. Some legislation that works. We need because of the 22 Act, we no longer have ground rent, so there's no incentive for the developer now to try and sell on the freeholds of these sites to a third party because there isn't a legitimate income stream. It's relatively easy to get new commonhold sites working once we have the piece of legislation that makes them work. They don't work for things like shared ownership at the moment. That's, the first big development in Milton Keynes, when the 2002 Act came through, had to be unwound as a commonhold site because they realised that it actually wouldn't work in practice. So it's just a matter of getting the legislation right. And there is no philosophical objection anymore from developers. They just need to be assured by the government that they're going to be able to sell the things. And logically, they should, because very naturally a commonhold asset is a better value asset than a lease, which is always a diminishing asset.
So we've had a situation where we have some developers that are very nearby. The Mayor of London is a big developer. He's got an extra 10,000 homes being built on Barking Riverside. He's got 25,000 homes going to be built on Old Oak Common. He has control over those assets. And much as he's declared that he's sympathetic to leaseholders, those tens of thousands of new build will mostly be leasehold. Do you think there's something the Mayor could do practically to convert those to commonhold?
Well, let others speak in a minute on this because I already had it. So it's the same thing I said earlier. There is nothing at the moment to stop a system coming forward which says the developer will provide a share of the freehold to a leasehold site when it's built so that it can easily convert to commonhold once we've got it working. Nothing. We don't need any legislation. We just say to the developers, that's what we'd like you to do.
So there's nothing really stopping the Mayor from doing that?
Nothing at all.
Mr. Scoffin.
I would go one further because Sadiq Khan promised in his manifesto, not the last mayoral election, but the one before, that he would give commonhold a whirl. He would do it on a GLA land, and he would do a pilot scheme. He didn't deliver it, and then it disappeared from the recent manifesto. And we would all very willingly support the mayor in delivering that pilot scheme. Obviously, commonhold under the 2002 law doesn't work with mixed-use buildings. So if there was any commercial, he wouldn't be able to make it work. But if it was a wholly residential building and say like 10 flats, because you see some of these schemes, they're not always high density, loads of units that the GLA are doing. He could get on and do that now. And it was odd because we never got to the bottom of why that wasn't delivered. You know, don't promise something and then not deliver it. And if you can't deliver it, just explain to everyone why you're not doing that. Because commonhold is the law. And if it is just a wholly residential scheme, let's try and make that work.
So the mayor is crying crocodile tears over the plight of many leaseholders, but doesn't appear to be taking any action to provide commonhold.
I'll defend the mayor on the leases situation because he actually got ahead of the central government by insisting that all new shared ownership homes come with 990-year leases, like standard. And it was so bizarre, the 2024 Act, there was a push in the Commons and the Lords to say that all new leases on flats would have to be 990, private sector, and the government never accepted that. But I think with the mayor, he made some really positive comments in The Guardian a few days before the recent mayoral election, saying that leaseholders should be able to withhold their service charges if they don't have accounts. And I think the key thing is he can't pass the law himself, but he should be advocating to central government now that Labour are in control of number 10 in the Treasury. So I think if he can do some more advocacy, publicly and privately, because this is immiserating people in London. And, you know, even if he can't change the law, he's got responsibility now to see it through. And also, as Martin was saying, where the developers, they can do a share of freehold now without any law change. And maybe that's where Sadiq Khan could use a bit of a carrot to give good publicity to those developers who are not waiting for the new law on commonhold, that are actually getting on and saying, look, we'll give you your share of freehold and you'll have control even if we don't have commonhold right now. So there's a combination. He could do his GLA pilot scheme commonhold, we'll support that, but he can then also put pressure, use his soft power on those developers to do share of freehold. And where he gives grant funding, he should be saying, as Tom Copley said to me at Quajo's book launch, brilliant Quajo, he was saying, what we could do is we could basically have a commitment with the new people that they do deals with to say that service charges should not increase above inflation. And I suggested, actually, you should take the funding off them, because there are certain BD Reside, there's other companies out there that sign up to the service charge charter and all of that. You've got to make that effective by saying we'll take the money away.
I'm specifically talking about commonhold here because, you know, if you have
he could do a pilot scheme.
If you were to have a choice between kind of fixing a bit leasehold or introducing commonhold, which would you go for?
Obviously commonhold, that's a real deal, and he could do a pilot scheme, hopefully, and we'll support that. He promised it.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Lord Bailey.
You turn my mic on. How successful are leaseholders in challenging unreasonable costs directly with the landlord? I'll start with Harry.
It's very, very difficult. So number one, if you challenge your landlord and even if you win, the landlord at the moment gets the right to put his legal costs on your service charge. So that already disincentivises you from standing up for, you know, basically being looted. You're not going to go to tribunal if they're going to dump the cost. Beyond that is the culture of the tribunal, and I'm not talking about individuals here, I'm talking about the culture, is not very friendly to litigants in person. That is just a reality. So I was in tribunal a few weeks ago, the freeholder did the usual trick, they brought in a barrister a few days before, the whole panel, the judge is, oh, old sport, you must have had a tough weekend swatting up on the case. And yet the poor leaseholder, the litigant in person, was reduced to tears when the panel barked at her for losing her place in a 1,000-page bundle. Yet if it was the barrister who'd been brought in at the last minute, Do you want to take 5 minutes, old sport? There's this English class system that sadly, unfortunately, doesn't reflect well on the tribunal. Another thing that's happening in the tribunals, has to be said, because we're the only ones that will say it, is they're starting to ask for the names of the attendees. I've gone to High Court, Supreme Court, all the rest of it. No one asked me for my name. Yet in the first tier tribunal, that is becoming routine. And it's a way of putting the fear of God into the tenants that are standing up for their rights. Beyond that, Martin was saying about a cost shifting. The tribunal already has power to award costs to leaseholders. Do they use it? Don't think they do. Professor Martin Dixon at the University of Cambridge recently said he'd be very interested to see the data on that. You know, so there is definitely a sort of landlord friendliness in the tribunal system that I think, unless you've actually attended some of these hearings, you won't ever understand, including the people that are reforming leasehold. They don't understand that when landlords delay things, because the tribunal doesn't want to be caught out on a procedural unfairness point, they bend the rules to let them submit late. If the leaseholder submits late, they come down like a ton of bricks. That has to change.
Let me just cut in on you a second. So, answer this scenario for me if you can. I'm a leaseholder. I take my landlord to court. I win. Do I still have to pay? Is it possible?
You can still pay his legal costs at the moment. Now, the 2024 Act is supposed to sort that out. So the idea is the tribunal would then be able to award costs, and it would be just and equitable. So the landlord would have to apply to get their costs. So it's still a bit of a question mark. But beyond your point, because you've just said, will you still have to pay? Beyond that, even if you win, it could take you 2 years to get that money back. So you've got to enforce the decision, normally in the county court. So there's a leaseholder we're dealing with at the moment. She won in December 2022. She's still waiting on her money. And she's literally going to get a hearing next year now from the county court. So even when you win, you actually lose. And only the most determined or retired people are willing to see this through to the end. The insurance case that I mentioned earlier, the leaseholders were originally told, fishing expedition, go away, don't worry your little heads. They then spent 4 years, 1.6 million on insurance commissions. So it's a systemic thing, and the tribunal, I understand, don't have the CPR rules on litigants in person. That must change. It needs to be a lot more friendly for leaseholders that are representing, because they're up against KCs. And every rule in the book is used and twisted and manipulated by landlords and their representatives. And that's a big thing. I think the tribunal needs to understand how hostile that whole atmosphere is at the moment, including taking down people's names like it's a school register. You don't do that, because landlords, I've even been to one with my own landlord, and the barrister, I won't name him, is very involved in leasehold law reform. We're involved in the Law Commission as well. There was a guy who was scared about giving his name, and he said John Doe. And the whole tribunal said, we're not continuing the hearing till he gives us his real name. And this landlord had threatened 120 leaseholders with defamation for having the temerity of going to tribunal to remove him with a court-appointed manager. So this is what a lot of legislators don't understand, that when we talk about redress, that's when you've fallen off a cliff with the ambulance picking you up. We don't want redress, we want control, we want ownership. So we don't want to rely on the tribunal. And I think when you look at a lot of the 2024 Act, including the stuff about decriminalising service charge information withholding, it expects that the tribunal is going to make it all better. In a lot of cases, it doesn't make it better.
OK, Limca, I have great sympathy for what you're saying. I sense a few amendments when this comes back to the Lords, just say. Let me move on to Martin. Martin, how successful are social tenants in challenging unreasonable costs directly with their landlord?
Yeah, this is a particular issue. And having spent quite a lot of my time in the tribunal, as a lay litigant, it is not a pleasant experience. I even represented Harry's site, and the landlord spent £74,000 in an afternoon trying to stop them get a residents' association up and running. Luckily, we won that one for them, but it's not nice. In the social sector, there is one advantage that the leaseholders can have sometimes, Some of them have leases which do not allow the landlord to pass on their legal costs to the service charge. They'll still pass those costs on to the general account, so the social rental tenants will end up paying for the fact. We've seen some awful cases, and I can sort of name Southwark as a particular. They will. We sat in the upper tribunal with them, trying to overturn a leaseholder's case in the lower tribunal, where she'd won. She was very, very dyslexic. We helped find her a pro bono solicitor and barrister. The landlord arrived with what is possibly the country's best leasehold KC, and 6 members of their staff, including their internal legal team. It was an utterly, utterly unfair system, and Southwark won simply by using legal might, and that happens time and time and time again.
That's very interesting. I'm going to make a personal plea that you and I and you speak again, because when this comes up in the laws, we will be making representations around this particular thing, because it sounds horrific. And I've been in a legal situation where the weight of the world is placed on you by a KC who knows what he's doing, and it becomes about their knowledge of the law, not their knowledge of the case. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you. To all three of you, actually, but mainly Martin. So we've talked about tribunal data and reasons for people going to tribunal in the first place. So if you have any data that you can share with the committee, for be it leaseholders, shared owners, or kind of, again, from your perspective and your campaigning and advocacy, that would be really helpful from all three of you. And I do think we've touched on whether or not we think it should be easier to take people, freeholders to court. So I think that's fine. So we've been jumping around a bit. You've naturally answered a lot of the questions that we do have. So apologies for that. So is there anything in addition to what you've said about the circumstances that leaseholders and social tenants who can't afford their service charges or any other leasehold costs, what happens to them? Kind of the worst case scenario situation, I suppose. That's to all three of you. Throat open. Let's start with Sue, because we haven't spoken to her for a while, and then we'll go to Harry and then Martin.
I just want to touch very briefly on the previous question, because of course shared owners as recipients of social housing also have the option of the Housing Ombudsman, and the Housing Ombudsman recently published a report on complaints in which it clarified that service charges is the 3rd most commonly complained about issue for shared owners, whereas it's 5th for social tenants more generally, so residents more generally. So the Housing Ombudsman is, I think, a useful source of information about the nature of complaints about service charges and the degree to which they're upheld and for what reasons. So
yeah, that's really helpful.
I just wanted to flag that up. And sorry, could you just...
What happens to somebody who can't afford their service charge or other costs associated with leasehold?
Of course, the Renters Reform, the Renters' Rights Bill is hugely significant for shared owners, because it makes the risk of falling behind with payments the same risk as it would be for leaseholders more generally, whereas previously shared owners could at worst lose their property without any reimbursement of the equity they'd invested in it. And there's 2 questions there. There's a question, how often does that happen? Undoubtedly for some shared owners that played out in the worst possible way. I don't have any data on how many shared owners have experienced that. I don't know if that data exists. But also there's a symbolic element. If you're being sold home ownership, but actually under a landlord-tenant relationship, you could hypothetically lose your home without reimbursement of the equity invested in it, that changes the feeling of being a homeowner. So the Renters' Rights Bill is hugely, hugely significant for shared owners at a symbolic level as well as a practical level. So what does happen at worst? There are a range of options that are offered to shared owners who fall behind with their housing costs. My concern is that some of those options simply pile on the debt. So if your arrears are bundled up as a payment plan, Well, that's helpful in the short term, but again, how does that increased burden of debt help you to achieve ongoing affordability and to achieve the ultimate goal, if that is your goal? And obviously not all shared owners are aiming for full home ownership, but for those who are, how does it help to bundle up your debt as a payment plan? So I'm going to leave that there, actually, because Martin,
Okay.
I think you may
Thank
want
you.
to pick that up.
Yeah, I've got a very specific request for you to change something in your service charge charter.
Recommend away.
Great.
Payment plans. It is fairly standard for social landlords to allow payment plans, but they do something rather naughty quite often. If you've agreed your service charge, you lose your right to go to the tribunal to challenge whether those costs are reasonable or not. So what the social landlords do is to put a clause in your payment terms which says you are agreeing the service charges. So there is no reason to put that in there, and it would be very helpful if your charter said specifically you should not put this in there.
Thank you. That was a question I had later for you. That was really helpful. Is there anything else you wanted to add before I go to Harry?
No.
Okay, wonderful. Harry.
Well, obviously, the worst case situation is forfeiture, where the whole home is seized and you don't get any compensation. And I know that there's this argument about it's technically rare and there's like 80 to 90 cases a year. It's a threat of forfeiture that basically forces, hapless tenants into paying these, bloated service charges. But beyond that, we have cases where people have gone into lifelong debt now because they just want to sell the thing to just get out of the service charge. Then you've got others like a 78-year-old military veteran who went back to work at Morrison's because he couldn't afford his service charge. You've got people that have become accidental landlords to live on houseboats because they can't afford the service charge. I think it's a really important point. I think everyone looks at leasehold as, it's a separate thing. It's about people that have bought a flat. It's affecting rental tenants too, because when service charges go up, sad to say, your rents get hiked too, because your buy-to-let landlord has a landlord of their own, and they have to protect themselves against the freeholder overcharging. And that's the reality. This is why I think renters need to get their heads in the game on leasehold, because leasehold is the first rung of the property ladder, and even if they can't ever afford to buy a flat, they're affected by leasehold by living in the block. Beyond that, they're affected by poor maintenance. They're the ones that can't get a hot shower in the morning to go to work because the freeholder, that they have no control over whatsoever, hasn't maintained the plant room because they see maintenance as a cost. But I think the reality is there's a really good analysis in the Financial Times a few months ago which basically said flat values in London are flat since 2019. So the service charges are having a huge impact. And we talk about service charge data. Hamptons has done some good data recently on this, but even they only look at the point of sale. We know so many developments where there's not even cladding issues or fire safety issues, but the flats are not coming to market because the service charges are too high. And I can say that in my own building. No one's been able to sell for about 2 years because the service charge is too high. People go, where's the swimming pool, where's the gym, where's the garden? And you go, no, I've just got a billionaire in Monaco. And lifts that don't work and windows that don't get washed. And they go, well, I'm not buying into this feudal money pit. And you say, well, don't blame you. But that's a big issue for Londoners. I think the fact is, even if you want to get out, you're trapped. And this is now beyond cladding. So I think that's a really important issue that for so many people, some people even taking on second jobs now as well to fund the service charge. So it really is a cost of living emergency for so many people in all income brackets. I think it's so important to say that. It doesn't matter who you are. If you've got a bad freeholder who's a freeloader, who's got a managing agent who's a henchman and want to extract as much money out of your home as possible, they will. And nothing really in the law is going to change that unless it's right to manage buying the freehold or moving to commonhold. I think that's a really key thing that is causing a huge amount of financial stress and emotional stress, and I think the government don't understand that they're making themselves politically vulnerable by punting this to the end of the Parliament. We speak to so many people, lifelong Conservative voters, who defected to Labour on this issue alone in July, and they're saying they're going off democracy in this country. Successive parties have promised to get rid of leasehold. Why aren't they getting rid of it? Why are they saying it's all complicated? You know, and you've got everyone, including on the leaseholder side, saying it's complicated. No. If you politically resource this thing, if you get in the best people, you do the Kate Bingham with the vaccines and all the rest of it, we're going to have flying cars before we get rid of a practically feudal property scheme. So I think that's really important, that we need pressure from the mayor to central government. They talk about making work pay. People on their phones crying because their service charge has gone up 40%. That's not making work pay, is it?
Okay. Thank you very much. Feudal money pits, a favourite for today. Thank you for that. Assembly Member Lord Bailey, do you have a supplementary or has it been covered?
It's been covered, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Assembly Member Small Edwards.
Thank you, Chair. I'm still on service charges. I just wanted to know how much, if we have any data on how much they have increased in recent years and what you think the main drivers are of that. And additionally, the Property Institute data reveals that service charges are rising faster in London than anywhere else. And yeah, could you get your thoughts on what you think is driving that as well? Maybe we'll start with Martin and go across.
Yeah, I mean, there have been a number of unfortunate influence on service charges. One of the particularly nasty ones was HMRC changed the VAT rules on staff costs. They used to historically be VAT free. For many sites there is now a VAT charge. We had huge increases in insurance following Grenfell. We're not seeing a reduction when buildings are remediated. We had awful problems with utility prices going up dramatically following the Ukraine war. So there are ongoing and unfortunate consequences coming out of the Building Safety Act. So there's lots of things that adversely impact how sites are going to operate beyond ordinary inflation rates. But the inability for the people paying the bills in most sites to have any influence whatsoever on their costs is what creates the huge problem. Everyone in the vast majority of sites is utterly disenfranchised from controlling the costs that relate to the running of their home. And it's simply not fair. It needs to change.
Shared ownership can be delivered as flats or houses, and research suggests that houses tend to be more affordable for shared owners than flats. Obviously, we're talking about London shared owners, where shared ownership will largely be delivered as flats. So I just wanted to flag up the scheme may work better in other parts of the country where it's delivered in the form of houses. Let's get that out of the way. Earlier on, you asked a question about data, which I didn't respond to at the time, but I have mentioned the JRF assessment that possibly at least 1 to 10 shared owners face total housing costs that are in excess of the 40% threshold. And I think this is where the question of data is hugely important. To what degree are service charges contributing to that position as compared to rent and mortgages and the other components of total housing costs? And I think it's important to have a good understanding of that. That would be data that would be very, very useful. Another aspect in relation to shared ownership and service charges, it tends to be delivered in a number of cases, possibly over half, in Section 106 agreements, where the housing association may have very limited to no control or influence over costs that are passed on by third party. Well, the costs originate with third parties, and the housing association passes those on to the shared owner, but may have little influence. And I think the problem there is that it undermines the affordability promise. If you have no influence or control over costs, why are we delivering this as an affordable housing scheme?
Yeah, I think the key thing is it goes back to the system itself, because the person that's paying the bill has no control, and you've got a third party who's there to extract as much fees and rents out of the captive homeowners as possible, tenants. I think the key thing is you've just got to give people control. And, you know, your committee back in 2012, they found in their own report that there is evidence that some large property companies have awarded contracts to subsidiaries of their own company at inflated prices. And then it talked about complex structure of interrelated companies of quasi-biblical proportions. And you've got the Law Commission that said the interest between leaseholders and landlords or freeholders or building owners, whatever you want to call them, are diametrically opposed, and consensus will be impossible to achieve. And what's interesting is, obviously, I heard you referring to the TPI for the managing agents. They put out service charge index. Hamptons do as well now. But it's the way they write it up is very vanilla. It's almost as if to say, oh, it's inflation, oh, it's the Building Safety Act, and not actually saying what the elephant in the room is that this is being gamed, service charges, in an industrial way, and this is a multi-billion-pound industry in other people's homes. And I think it's easy to forget that when you look, you know, and I think Hamptons, they have come out and said 7.6 billion leaseholders were paying in flats last year. That is not normal. That is not for the cost of upkeep. That is commissions. Beyond that, it is also phantom invoices. So we know with a lot of our supporters, freeholders are charging for services that were never even delivered. And also, you know, it's the markups, it's the phantom invoices, that will go with commonhold. And I think that's where the pressure is. We don't want to faff around with leasehold. We need to move to commonhold, get rid of leasehold. But if you leave it to the end of the Parliament, we're going to be where we were with the Tories, where we get a very thin bill at the end, which has clearly been lobbied for, and it doesn't actually deal with the root issues. And I think that's where Labour needs to prioritise this. The Mayor of London needs to put pressure on his own party in central government, because that's what we want, control and ownership, like they have in Scotland and the rest of the world. So it's just very frustrating, because I've read all the great work your committee's done over many years. You know, Steve Connell, I think, Jenny Jones, you know, Umesh Desai, all the same issues. Let's just give people control, because what's going to happen is that voters are going to fight back at the next elections. They really will. They'll go to extreme parties as well. I think people are missing that if a government can't protect its citizens from what in a lot of cases is fraud, what is the point of the government? I think that's a really important point. People are looking at other parties outside of Labour and Conservative on this issue because they feel this is a cost of living thing. And it's like legal cheating, what's going on here. And it's just unbelievable that you've had so many committees, as brilliant and talented and caring as you all are. Why are we still having more committees on this? Why can't we just deliver it like the rest of the world? I think that's the thing. Service charges is ruining people's lives. You know, can't we just give control to the people paying the bills like they do in the rest of the world? I just don't understand it. Why we even need to collect data? We shouldn't need to if we're in control. You know, we're not going to rip ourselves off, are we? And I think that's the real worry, that we're going to be policy lab rats, and I'm going to be like Martin Boyd here with greying hair, and I'm going to be advising you all. No, but it feels like that. We're going to be policy lab rats forever. We just want this system abolished. We don't want to create more jobs for quangocrats. We don't want to, you know, we don't want to just allow freeholders to still exist. They need to go. Why are we making it so complicated? I just don't understand it. Look at assisted dying. That was complicated. They've rammed that one through. Why can't you give us control? I just don't understand it. Why? Is it because of some billionaires that fund the parties? What's going on here? Is it because of lobbying? I just don't get it. Even the insurance stuff, the decriminalisation of service charges, the withholding of information. Why wasn't that discussed? Not here, but beyond this area. Why are we going round and round in circles? Reform is a dead end. Every act that they pass Parliament overrides another act. There's a loophole here, there's a loophole there. Why can't we just give people control? I really don't get it. And Labour, the government, like the Tories before, are making themselves so politically vulnerable. Honestly, there's going to be a reckoning. There really will be. And it's just, I just don't understand it.
Harry, I'm loath to cut you off mid-flow.
No, but I just don't get it. It's not that complicated.
The passion is very, very apparent. I thank you for that. But I'm just keen that we... But if there's anything in addition afterwards, everybody's welcome to write in. So if I could just move us on, is that... Yep. Assembly Member Garbutt.
Just to quickly pick up on the conversation we've just had, do service charges increases vary in relation to the type of freehold, so council, housing association or private? I don't know, Martin, if you want to just quickly answer that one. Another one.
In the social sector, there is a problem that comes out of the fact that lots of local authority landlords don't have sinking funds, stroke reserve funds, and also what they tend to do is their primary interest is in the maintenance of their estate, not to be particularly interested in the flats in an individual block, and that can often result in huge major works bills. You know, and it's common to see bills in excess of £20,000. It's sometimes up £50,000-60,000, and they are utterly unaffordable for anyone who lives in those buildings. The registered social landlords have a slightly different approach. There you can see leaseholders who will pay more in their service charges than the private sector leaseholders will pay, simply because they have an intermediate landlord. So they end up paying the full service charge plus their intermediate landlord's service charge on top of that to oversee the service charge. And then in the private sector, it is the Wild West. If you've got resident controlled developments, mostly they work very well. There are unfortunately the odd exception. Had a case come to us today where the directors of the RMC seem to have set up their own company to provide some of the services to the site, and the other leaseholders are concerned that there's a lack of transparency. It may be entirely legitimate, it may be quite unlegitimate. When you have a third-party landlord, you have a range of inefficiencies there, as well as, you know, Harry referenced in the 2012 report the quasi-biblical structure. I'm afraid I'm guilty of being the person in the tribunal case where the judge reached that conclusion. Our landlord was letting contracts to his own companies. It was a set of companies within his organisation, 400 of them. It was impossible to know who was dealing with who, with what, who was making what profit where. So it will be different elements of profit. The worst aspects within the private sector are, we unfortunately have a subset of landlords who are very actively looking to manipulate the rules, where they will have 3 tenders come in for work, but all 3 of the companies tendering happen to be in the same building. And they happen to be in the same building that the landlord happens to be in as well. And it's very difficult, as Harry said. You know, I would sort of claim the grey hair comes out of having children, and rather than going to the tribunal, but
I've got pink hair, so you can include mine in any way you want. Thank you for that. I'm really glad you explained that, because the relationship I've had with kind of residents as a councillor has really spoken to those issues, like that lack of transparency and this feeling that there's different bodies being set up and just finding it really hard to navigate. My next question is something that I'm really interested in, which is estate regeneration and the impacts that has on residents more widely. But this is specifically about what levels of service charge increase do leaseholders and social tenants experience after estate regeneration. And I don't know who might want to start, Harry, or yeah, do you want to? Yeah, no, Martin, you can go for it. Yeah.
So, estate generation creates some huge problems for the leaseholders, because the compulsory purchase system for existing properties almost never seems to produce a fair result, and what quite often happens is that the people end up having to buy back a proportion of their property, and then what the social landlord says is, well, we'll do this deal so long as you're in the property, you won't pay the rental element, But the moment you come to sell, as effectively a shared owner, it returns to the fact that that property will incur the rent if somebody else buys at a shared ownership level. So there's no way for someone to pass their property on to their children at that point, because it stays specifically with them, not. The estate regeneration has produced a number of complexities in London over the year, because different social landlords want to redevelop in different ways. It's very clear because of cost pressures that have existed in recent years that social landlords are having to incorporate a number of private sale properties within their redevelopment schemes. So they may sort of produce denser housing, but the proportion of social rental housing will go down substantially. And quite often the social housing is moving to the poorer quality areas within an estate as well. So you'll get nice new private sector flats go up in the bits that overlook the nice parts of town or whatever, and then the social rental tenants are stuck round the corner.
Yeah, it's a little bit related to the previous question as well, because I know the committee with Umesh Desai mentioned about mixed use, because it's a big thing in London, that to have that combination of residential and commercial premises in a development or in a block. Leaseholders in those blocks and developments are particularly vulnerable, particularly where the overall freeholder or the head leaseholder, the landlord, has a connection with the commercial parts. So take my own building, there's a hotel underneath. We believe that we have been subsidising the running of that hotel. So the fact is you've got a massive conflict of interest. Already leasehold's not great. You make it worse when you've got the freeholder or the landlord involved in the running of the commercial premises. And I think that's where the 2024 Act goes some way to bring the 25% rule up to 50. Unfortunately, for many people that would otherwise have benefited from that reform to buy the freehold, they actually won't be able to, where there is a plant room or shared services in a building. So unfortunately, even though you thought you were a winner, you were actually not going to be able to qualify under that. You will be able to qualify under right to manage, which is something. And there's another really big issue, which is higher rise buildings, because buildings over 18 metres at the moment, because of an error with the Building Safety Act, you are unable to remove your freeholder over building safety functions. And that's a big, big issue. So anyone who can't get right to manage or can't buy the freehold, they have a right under the Landlord and Tenant Act 1987 to get a court-appointed manager. Right now, that's been interfered with, and it's quite unusual because if the freeholder can't be trusted to run your service charges, why on earth should they be allowed to manage fire safety? And yet there's an error, and Martin was saying about there were a load of amendments that were going to come through, unfortunately was scuppered by the early general election. That was one, and I believe Lord Bailey, others in the Commons, but others in the Lords as well, were pushing on this. That needs to be fixed. But beyond that, making sure that when we do move to commonhold, those in mixed-use buildings don't get left behind. And that's a really important point. The 1993 Act, sections 3 and 4, basically mean if you've got a plant room or even a bit of electricity that connects the commercial to residential, you will not qualify to buy the freehold, which is crazy. So, that needs to be looked at, and because mixed use is all the rage now in London. You have to factor in mixed use, going beyond even the Law Commission.
That's a really strong point, and then I'm going on to the next question, right? Yeah, so it was really interesting you've brought up building safety and insurance, which is going to be our next sector of questioning. So just the opening question is, what impact have building safety measures had on service charges in London? Sorry, I'm going to cough.
Ruinous costs. I've just had a development that's come through to me, and they've been charged in Wimbledon over £1 million under Building Safety Act related charges. Obviously that's not right, and hopefully it will be dealt with, but it just shows you that there was some really good work by Endar cladding scandal, and the Telegraph newspaper a few months ago was basically saying a lot of the costs of the Building Safety Act and the Building Safety Regulator are being passed down in service charges, whether rightly or wrongly. And I think at the time, the Housing Minister, Lee Rowley, with the head of the Building Safety Regulator, had to write the sort of grovelling letter to industry to say, look, we know we've dumped a load of regulations on you, but don't completely loot leaseholders. Don't use that as an excuse. But I think that's what's happening. So I think there is an element, before we rush to regulate managing agents, we need to look at the costs of the building safety regulator, obviously set up in a noble fashion, you know, after Grenfell, 72 people died, but we've just got to make sure who's paying for the costs of all that regulation, and is it being used to monetize service charges even more than they have been. I think that's really important to strain that, you know, as well, how does the Building Safety Act now interact with leasehold reform policies? And I think that key thing about anyone in a building over 18 metres can no longer get rid of a rogue freeholder for building safety. And that was supposed to be fixed, and there's no reason why the Labour government needs to leave that to the end of the Parliament. That's ready to go, and we could do that. And I think beyond that, just looking at the Building Safety Act again, because I think it shows you with good, you know, good intent, you can cause lots of issues there. So I think we just need to look at that, because I think it's easy to just parcel it off as old cladding, old post-Grenfell, but it's now entwined with leasehold.
Was there anyone else who wanted to come in on, building safety?
Yeah. I'll put my lease hat on for this one, because I think this is a very important point to be made. Lease work across both England and Wales, and Wales has taken a substantially different route to England in the way that they're dealing with building safety matters. They don't have things like the qualified and non-qualified status for leaseholders, so that was rather ironic that a Labour government in Wales should decide we didn't need qualified leaseholders, but a Conservative government in the UK did. The costs of compliance with the Building Safety Act in England are not pleasant to deal with. There is an awful lot that's unclear. As an RMC site that has to deal with building safety issues, I know I have a property manager who tells me there are still many, many things that are unclear about how you should be charging for things, what you should be charging, how often you should be charging. We need to get back to stability in the market, and until we do, we're going to see severe damage to property sales. At LKP, we have an as yet unpublished estimate which says potentially building safety crisis has taken somewhere between 75 and 100 billion pounds out of the sales of flat properties across England. That is a huge, huge number, and it's going to keep going until such time as we get a more robust system in place.
Thank you. That was, back to you, Chair.
I'm going to bring in, I think, Assemblymember Lord Bailey, you potentially had a supplementary to this, but I just wondered, this is just anecdotal, but I have experienced where building safety works have happened to a building, and so the building is remediated at the cost of the, kind of via the fund, and then homes are put back on the market, and one would assume that the service charges would drop, but they increase. And if you have any kind of a logical or rational explanation for why that happens beyond what feels like price gouging, it would be really helpful if you could send that information to us. I mean, what would be the reasoning behind that? It's counterintuitive to me.
We're trying to collect some data at Lease, and Lease now works very closely with Endar Cladding Scandal, who are also collecting data. Lease ran an insurance survey recently looking at costs. We haven't published the results of that yet. It doesn't take a lot to guess what those results will say, which is that insurance costs have gone up an awful lot on particularly high-rise buildings, and they're not coming down in the way that everyone expects them to do once buildings are remediated.
Anybody else?
But it's the layers of layers upon regulation, even door checkers every quarter. It sounds right, but you need to be able to cap or control those costs, because at the moment it just feels like a free-for-all. Everyone is charging anything that they can, even a resident engagement strategy. How much should that cost? It just seems like it's another excuse for freeholders to rip off leaseholders and in the managing agents. So I think the whole thing needs to be reviewed, because it just seems like that they're using it to permanently bring up service charges. You know, even if there isn't any bad intent, it feels like we're now pushing service charges such a level, and all the house building now is flats. We've got the second lowest proportion of flats of any country in the whole of Europe after Ireland. They didn't like leasehold. They didn't want to be subjugated by landlords. Why are we then making service charges so expensive that no one, unless they're very, very wealthy, will buy a flat, whether it's shared ownership or pure private leasehold or even commonhold? And I think that's the worry, that all these building safety regulations could kill off commonhold. I think that's a really important point. And I know that there was work done a few years ago where they were saying that they would criminalise commonhold association directors. And there's an element of, hang on a second here, are we going from one extreme of no one really caring about high-rise buildings to then another where it's like we're regulating it and killing it? And it's almost, it's gone from one, I think that's the worry, that we're going too far with this regulation now.
Okay, thank you. Sue.
Martin has mentioned Endar cladding scandal, and I just wanted to emphasise that their work really shines a spotlight on how many shared owners are affected by this issue. Something that the campaign has also been shining a spotlight in is the question of distressed sales, where shared owners aren't able to access buyback, and they're resorting to distressed sales that ultimately are a very adverse outcome for people who are maybe making a loss on sale as their only route out of the situation.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Boff.
How do service charges vary depending upon the building type? For example, how does a service charge on a tall building compared to a low-rise building? Do you have any data on that?
Naturally, the bigger, the more complex, the charges are just going to be higher, whatever the structure, whether it's leasehold, commonhold, strata title, condominium, whatever you want to call it. And I think that's something that's never going to change, but it's a question of who is the one controlling the building. And if they're not the residents, they have every incentive to bring up those service charges as high as they can. But I think when you even look at ONS data, because they do the English housing survey now, I think they've done it now for the last 2 years, called Leasehold Households. It's a good report. It's got a tiny sample size, only think a few hundred, but they've now started to introduce about right to manage. That would be something really worth looking at in terms of what is the average service charge for buildings under democratic resident control versus those under a third party or external freeholder landlord, because I think we were saying earlier 20% saving easily we're seeing with our members, even 35% when they get right to manage. So I think, yes, there's an element, and there's the London School of Economics keep pushing this argument that buildings are complex, they're always going to be expensive, to a point. I think we need to be able to separate out the costs that are unavoidable of running a building, a block of flats, from the costs that is all the fee farming and all the commissions and all the, hid phantom invoices that are going on in leasehold with the third-party landlords. But if we can do that, the cost difference, I think, will still be quite major. And obviously, for a small block, one up, one down, there's no lifts, there's no common parts, their costs will be on the floor. But even Hamptons came out this year and said that in 10 years' time, there'll be no flats in the whole of England with a service charge of less than £1,000. So that will go extinct soon. And that's not always to do with freeholders, but a lot of the time it is. The BBC did good coverage the other week, Tara Welsh, and you were seeing these houses that were converted into flats, 2 units, and the service charge £3,000, £4,000, £5,000, £6,000. That can't be for the upkeep of the block.
Could you say that the more complex the building, the more opaque the charges are?
It depends on the freeholder, but that would go with the territory, yes, especially if they are linked to the commercial premises. Or that, yeah, the more complex the building, there are more cost centres associated with that building, and there are more areas to hide things. 100%.
Just a small supplementary here, a slightly different tack. Should the Mayor be ensuring that affordable housing funds are used to support commonhold or shared freehold development rather than leasehold, do you think?
100%. But I think a lot of it will boil down to shared ownership, because they've put that scheme on steroids, haven't they? Successive mayors. So you've kind of, I know you're not going to be happy with me saying it, almost kill off shared ownership on new flats because it's such a toxic scheme. It's got all the worst elements of leasehold and then times by 1,000. I don't think it's affordable at all. Our supporters, they don't like it. The only way that they like it is when they get right to manage, when they get control of the managing agent or they kick out the housing association. That's the only thing that they like it for. Unless it's on houses, maybe that works on houses where you don't have, service charges in that way. And I think that's a big thing. People need to look at shared ownership generally as a model. If so few people staircase to 100%, why on earth are you calling it home ownership? Why are you calling it affordable?
I mean, and is there scope perhaps for new shared ownership schemes to switch to a commonhold basis rather than leasehold?
100%. And the Law Commission looked at this. And I know some people are agnostic about shared ownership in commonhold. If we have to still have shared ownership, we're going to have to make it work in commonhold. And actually, some of the enlightened housing associations, like the Guinness Partnership, they came out and said, actually, if shared owners, irrespective of their equity stake, are paying service charge, the moral thing is to let them have control of the service charge in a commonhold scheme. Because there was an argument, if they're shared owners, it'll still be a leasehold product in commonhold. Unless they staircase to 100, to be a common holder, they shouldn't have control. And our view is they need to have control in common hold.
Do you think there'll be different costs? If they
there will, and there's an argument here, and I know there's been a whole row about poor doors for years in this country. If you're bringing shared ownership into a private block, we have to have a discussion about you're putting people together with very different income brackets. And the reality is someone that is of a higher earning bracket, and I know it's not popular to say this, would want to probably invest in that plant room probably more. They've got the ability to do that, as opposed to more of the lower income side of things where they'll want to delay the costs. So I think there's an argument of, if we have to continue shared ownership, maybe you need shared ownership only blocks. And I know that sounds really elitist to say it, but if you're going to have an alignment of interest in commonhold, you've got to make sure that people are generally of a similar economic background in each block. Otherwise, you're going to have the rows that you get with third-party freeholders in commonhold. That's not good. We want to make sure that everyone has got that alignment of interest.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
Did you have another question?
Are
you fine?
Did not, because the question that I had down had been answered previously.
Fine. Okay. Assembly Member Lord Bailey.
Just to come back to your last point, do people have to have the same financial power, as it were, or could they just have the same contractual situation? So if you and I both live in a shared ownership block, as long as we both have the same sort of tenure, then you can fix the rules to work. So the idea of a fully shared ownership block should be enough to work. We don't have to have the same financial circumstances, surely.
I think it depends in terms of, if everyone's buying into the shared ownership product, that's fine. But it's putting people from extreme differences where you've got luxury flats in shared ownership in a block. Because the reality is, and I'm not trying to cast aspersions, some of the people in the luxury flats will want the maintenance to a much higher standard. And I'm not trying to mock, but even gold leaf. And then obviously shared owners, they will have far more financial pressures than those that have got the more swanky properties.
I think we're saying the same thing. You would just make the flats, of a similar value. You would have £1 million flats with £200,000. Let me ask you a question, Sue. How do you feel about shared ownership? I know this isn't about shared ownership, and the chair will stop me shortly. But I am an ex-shared ownership. Owner, as it were. I would not have been able to get onto the property ladder without that. I certainly wouldn't have been able to buy the house I've put now, because I'm now doing Help to Buy, but whatever. How do you feel? Do you think it should be abolished, is the question I'm asking?
I think the debates about shared ownership can become very polarised. So on the one hand, you've got the sector saying it's a great product. On the other hand, you've got people who've been through the experience of it saying it's a scam. I hope it's been evident from our answers to previous questions that undoubtedly those shared owners who say it worked for them, we hear that over and over again, but there are a lot of people who've had very adverse outcomes. We've been talking about data earlier on. Data is key. We need to understand who it works for, who it doesn't work for, and then whether the people it does work for are the best use of subsidy. So I think it comes back to data. We need data. we need data to answer that question.
Thank you. This conversation has made your point make more sense to me, Chair. Back to you.
Okay, before we move on, we actually have another guest online. I just wanted to ask you, so the Mayor of London, through the AHP, will fund homes for shared ownership, and a housing association will develop them and make that sale. So the data that you talk about of who is moving in, I wonder if you know where that data is, like who knows who's living in the shared ownership building, basically? Or is it just the grant is handed over and somebody moves in at some point and that's it, that's the end of the contract?
I think over the years, numerous people have commented on the paucity of data about shared ownership. Now, we have to be realistic about this. It's not possible to collect data on every aspect of the tenure, the nature, the characteristics of the households, the relationship between, you know, it's a house or a flat, it's somebody who's coming in on a 90,000 income, or it's a household that's coming in paying for a share with cash, maybe from the sale of a family home, and then reliant on, you know, welfare benefits. There's such a diversity of households coming into shared ownership, mixed up with is it a house or is it a flat? Is it an urban area? Is it in a rural area with a staircase and cap? There's an awful lot of aspects to consider here, and it's not realistic to capture data on all of them. There's a challenge there, but we need some data, because it needs to be targeted towards the people it works best for and not targeted towards the households where there is most likely to be adverse outcomes. There has been some research over the years. So there's a starting point for looking at who it works best for and who it doesn't. But I think we've touched on service charges. I think we know that it's likely that people are paying more than 40% of their incomes, and that over time it's increasingly likely that people will be paying. Some households, again, I come back to the complexity of this. If somebody comes in and they're beginning of a career, they're a high-flying professional, they may keep up with the escalating charges. So again, we need to be understanding, does it matter if you come in as a young person or maybe you're coming in as a retired person? There's an awful lot to look at. I don't think I can answer the question of how we begin to collect that data. All I can say is it's really important that we arrive at an understanding of what kind of data is most useful and is affordable to collect. And that's probably the start. There's a conversation to be had about what data is most important. Can I make a related point, though? The regulator of social housing is collecting tenant satisfaction measures. That's shown that satisfaction is very low for shared owners. However, in some respects, we've got big gaps in that satisfaction data, because what's not being collected is data on satisfaction with service charges. What's not being collected is data on whether people are satisfied with the scheme in terms of ongoing affordability, the financial sustainability of their home, and we're not collecting data on satisfaction with the scheme as a pathway to full home ownership. And I wonder if we were collecting that data on satisfaction, then that might help to understand where we should be targeting the hard data on what's working and what's not working.
Thank you for that. This links in with what we were just speaking about. So the Mayor caps rent and service charges on the London living rent properties and is proposing to do so on the key worker living rent properties. I wondered if any of you could speak to if you know if these caps are successful in protecting residents from unreasonable costs. If you could speak to each. Great. Great. Because my follow-up question was going to be, and do you think these caps could be extended to other forms of housing like shared ownership if we don't think they're being helpful?
Shared ownership often is described as having capped rent, but of course, and I think people misunderstand that, if it's capped to inflation, then it may become unaffordable if inflation is high. So, and also the costs are sometimes described as subsidised at 2.7%, but that's only in year one. So when we're looking at why the costs are increasing to beyond the 40% measure that sets the affordability criteria at the beginning, it's because, to some degree, because the capping is linked to inflation. And I do wonder if the scheme would be more affordable if it were linked, for example, to wage inflation. Now, that raises a question of, does it then become viable to deliver as a scheme? And I can't answer that question, but I certainly think what inflation measure you're linking the cost to, whether it's RPI, CPI, wage inflation, they're important questions to be considering. So I'm very interested in this scheme of linking the costs of housing to wage inflation. I think that's very interesting. And it's very interesting to see if that's going to result in high satisfaction measures from people who are part of that scheme than we're seeing for shared ownership, where satisfaction is pretty low.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. Did you want to come back in, Martin?
Yeah, we had Florey's Law passed in 2014, which was designed to cap maximum service charges. It never worked as a system, unfortunately. So we end up with a position where the social landlord will sit there and say, well, if you try and cap my service charges, where else am I going to get the money from if I can't get it from the leaseholders? And the leaseholders sit there and say, well, if my service charges aren't capped, I'm potentially living in an utterly unaffordable property. And it needs some bigger picture thinking. The fundamental problem we have with leasehold properties is there is no outside source of capital potentially. You will always get buildings where you were talking earlier about, different buildings having different sort of costs. It's accepted around the world that as our higher rise buildings begin to age, some of them are going to face some very large costs. Now, collectively, and in other parts of the world, there are systems where those sites can go out and say, well, we'll borrow an amount of money so we can spread the cost over 20 years for doing something to the building. We have nothing. In the service charge regime, you either have the money that you've collected or you don't. And I think it's one of the good things we can get out of commonhold, that we can start to put money into the system. We can spread costs. I mean, one of the things that particularly annoys me, and it's a bit off your question, but it's relevant, is that it's slightly related to what Harry says, is, as people pass through their lives, they have different levels of affordability. And in particular, when you get someone who's reaching towards the end of their life, they may be on a fixed income, very easily on a fixed income. In the leasehold world, you don't have any alternative if they don't or can't afford to pay their service charge, other than to begin to take them through the court process in contemplation of forfeiting their lease. And that applies whether it's the private sector or the social sector. It is morally and ethically bankrupt as a system. We on our side, as an RMC director, have to put legal risks on our head by not pursuing someone in that position through the courts. There could be an argument that we have effectively waived our right to recover the money from them. But what else do we do? Do we actually do that? So it's a very important issue to consider.
Thank you for raising that. Thank you. Back to the chair.
Thank you, and thank you for that response. So we've been joined by our fourth guest, Suze Mooner, who's a campaigner with Social Housing Action Campaign. So what I'm proposing to do, we have two more questions which relate to the three of you that are already here. You're welcome to stay after that, or you're welcome to leave. Once we get to the end of those two, which Suze will also take part in, we will switch to the online meeting with her and continue to kind of go back in a little bit of a loop. The first question is to you, Suze. Welcome. hopefully you've heard a bit of the conversation we've had about service charges and so on. I'm just wondering, I'm going to ask everybody here what impact the Service Charges Charter and Leasehold Guide for Londoners has, and how can that be improved. Somebody, I think it was Martin, mentioned earlier the changes around tribunals, but to you, Suze, we wanted to understand the same from the perspective of your campaign's work for social housing residents. So perhaps we'll start with you, Suze, and then...
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, and good to see you, and thanks for accommodating me at a different time. I was teaching today, so it was very difficult, you know, to get away earlier. Just on the point, I did catch some of the, you know, some of the discussion, not all of it. But just on the point, obviously, the guests who were in the room, Sue and Harry and Martin, obviously they're talking about leaseholders. The point I want to make is all of that also applies to tenants as well. And tenants are largely written out of the discourse. They are completely excluded from the discourse on service charges. So, for example, the representations we've been making to government, the response that we get is, but leasehold reform is on its way. So, you know, these problems are going to be fixed. Well, we don't believe those problems will be fixed even for leaseholders or shared owners, but it certainly won't touch the problems that tenants are experiencing. So tenants are also having all of these problems, and it's often kind of excluded. It's often left out of the picture, and it is having the same dramatic impact on them, because also with these charges going up, we can't see really that it can be fixed by tweaking any one small part of the system. There is no one small fix that can be applied. There are certainly fixes that we think could make a really massive difference, but we haven't seen any of them being proposed. But we really think that because of all the interlinkages, I mean, one of the things that really comes off sitting slightly back and listening to the debate that was going on is this point about how all interlinked all these different elements are. You know, so it's like a ball of string. You can't just pull one part and think that it's going to solve the problem. You have to look at it in a really coherent way. So just one of the things we would like to see in SHAC, and it seems so kind of startlingly easy to us. I can't understand, it's very difficult to understand why it hasn't been applied, which is a system where there are disputed service charges, because we are talking about the service charges that are just out and out wrong. The ones where people are being charged for a concierge and there is just no concierge in that block, or for lift maintenance and there is just no lift in that block to be maintained. So what we would call the fraudulent charges, we can't see them as being anything else. Invoices are put in for work that just doesn't exist, and there's a massive amount of it. And we would like to see those kind of disputed charges that the tenants or residents, and by residents we mean shared owners or leaseholders, they can pay the disputed amount to a court, as they do in, I believe it's Spain has got this system. You pay it to a court. The landlord or freeholder then who is a landlord anyway, but who has to then prove that charge is legitimate. So they have to produce a photo of the lift being maintained, or, you know, a contract to say that there is a concierge at that block, and only then would the money be released. And what that does is really kind of cast it in a fair way, because at the moment the system is so unfair. It's pay up now, challenge later, if you can get the information, if you can find legal advice, if you can get into court. So all of these barriers exist for the tenant and resident, and this will be a way of really rebalancing the playing field, really. So tenants couldn't just get out, and residents couldn't just get out of paying charges that they didn't want to pay, because they'd still have to pay them. They just pay them to the court. And the landlord wouldn't make a profit out of the service charges, which is what they're clearly doing at the moment. I don't know if that answers your question.
A little bit.
Kind of a bit mid-flow a bit, I suppose.
No, that's okay. It does a little bit. I'm going to put a couple of questions to the panellists in the room, and then we'll continue on with our bit of service charges whilst they depart, and then continue with the rest. So we will cover everything, I promise. So to Martin, Sue and Harry, as I said, what impact, if any, do the Service Charges Charter and Leasehold Guide for Londoners have, and what improvements could be made to it. And if I could maybe just add to that, what more could the Mayor do to support leaseholders and social tenants who struggle with high costs? So maybe roll those together if it's possible.
Yeah. I've been involved in at least one of those documents, helping the GLA, so I can't really criticise it too much. Both documents do need updating. There are missing elements. The whole set of issues about Building Safety Act, which need to be incorporated in the documents. There's one other thing, and I'll definitely put my lease hat on for this one. I came into the whole of this leasehold system because I felt that resident engagement doesn't work properly. Landlords very actively tried to disrupt. In the social sector, they will quite often try and create rifts between the social rental tenants, the shared ownership tenants, and the right to buy tenants. So one of the things I did when I joined Lease was to go back yet again to see if we could get better resident engagement. We've worked with the Tribunal and the Building Safety Regulator and with the TPI about producing a standard residents association constitution, because although Susan's talking about social rental tenants, the one group of tenants that has no formal representation system within the leasehold world are the PRS tenants. So we have on any one site long leaseholders, we have AST tenants, we have private sector tenants, we have shared ownership leaseholders. They all need to have a better voice, so they're in a better position to challenge the costs that they face.
Thank you very much. Sue or Harry, do you want to add anything?
Transparency is really important, and I think that transparency at the point of sale is absolutely key, because so many shared owners expressed the view that they did not understand what they were getting into in terms of future costs at the point of sale. Before this meeting, I just had a quick look at where potential entrants to the scheme might find information and what they would find. So I looked at the key information document. The key information document on london.gov.uk signpost to the gov.uk website for information about service charges and other expenses. And that website signposts the model lease, but the model lease is silent on 100% liability for costs. Gov.uk signposts to lease regarding service charges, but that particular hyperlink directs to a page that has no information on service charges in a shared ownership context. And then I put in a search on lease for shared ownership service charges. I got 755 results, many of which weren't actually relevant. So even if you go looking for information as a potential entry to the scheme, trying to actually find information is very, very difficult. So coming back to the Charter, which was your question, it requests reasonable estimates on charges. It gives a best practice guidance of 3 years. I would say that should be a minimum requirement. Shared owners need to understand the long-term implications of service charges, and providers need to be getting and providing realistic assessments of how service charges may play out in their specific development over time. And, you know, that will be taking into account things like, are there lifts or aren't there? Are there common... It should be possible to produce some kind of reasonable estimate. No one can predict the future, but some kind of reasonable estimate of how those service charges may play out, so people can make an informed assessment of whether they're likely to be able to keep up with those charges. So that was on transparency at the point of sale. I also wanted to pick up on the affordability point. There is affordability guidance in there, but I wonder how useful the Charter is if affordability isn't monitored and guidance isn't enforced.
And then finally, Harry.
Yep, so for the service charge charter, I think it needs a bit more teeth in terms of enforcing it. So I think when there's a delivery partner that's signing up to abiding by the principles, maybe there could be a covenant in the deal with the GLA or the mayor to say if you don't abide by these principles, maybe if the service charges get too high, you'll have to pay back the money. Because I think the thing is, it's all about incentives. If they don't feel that there's any jeopardy for them not upholding the principles of the charter, they're not really going to follow it. And beyond that, it's going back to what the mayor can do. The whole leasehold reform agenda and commonhold, many groups are being managed by the state, by the government. The Mayor of London has a unique role to convene leaseholders, to actually have town halls like we used to do 10, 15 years ago under the last Labour government. He could do town halls, not too many, but a few, to bring people together so that there's actually an avenue for people in an uncontrolled way to be able to feed into policy. Because I think that's what's lacking at the moment. There's all these groups that do great work, but they're all being very much managed by the state, by the system. Sadiq Khan has a moral responsibility there. He's committed to the commonhold pilot scheme, fair enough. He's not been able to do it, but he's an advocate for leaseholders. Do the town halls. Because I think the reality is we need pressure on central government, and he's uniquely placed to do that. So I think that's really important, and it's not going to cost any money. And beyond that, the Liberal Democrats had a proposal, I think a few years ago now, about a support hub. I'm actually in favour of that. A lot of our supporters are, because actually, yes, the Leasehold Advisory Service want to do everything, but actually, why doesn't the mayor have his own resource? Leasehold is all over the capital. There should be some resource there which has got a uniquely London flavour, where there is support for people doing tribunal actions, where there is a bit more raising awareness. And I think the guide as well, trying to explain what leasehold is, I think more about, not all leasehold is bad. If you've got a resident management company where it's leaseholder controlled or right to manage, can actually be a good thing. I think breaking that down a bit more, because I think right now everyone's seeing the media, everyone's panicking, and they're not wanting to buy leasehold. But I think it's the third-party freeholders that the guide could just clarify a bit more, that there is different forms of leasehold, and that, you know, commonhold is obviously the best bet. We've not got that yet, but here's what you could look out for if you're looking at buying a flat. Because I think at the moment everyone's worried about buying any leasehold property. But when you explain there's right to manage, there's resident management companies, there's share of freehold, and that gives you control of your costs, I think that's good, because people aren't being able to sell their flats right now beyond the cladding. So I think, but the town halls is vital. Don't just let central government control the agenda, which they've been doing for years, you know, with co-opted groups. We need to be making sure that there's spontaneous engagement of leaseholders feeding into policy.
Thank you for that. I'm going to adjourn the meeting for about 3 minutes so we can allow you to leave if you want to. You're welcome to stay, but you don't have to. And so we can just reorder the questions that we have left for Suze. So thank you very much for everything. Welcome back to our meeting. Thank you very much for your patience, Suze, while we just reorder ourselves. I have some of the questions that we've put to the other guests. We're going to put some of those to you. So I'm going to ask my colleague, Assembly Member Small Edwards, to pick up his question to you.
Good afternoon, Suze. I just want to ask, what are the unique challenges that social tenants face in relation to service charges?
I think that's a simple one to answer. I don't think there is anything that makes social tenants unique in that sense. So just to be clear, although we started out as a social housing action campaign, we do have a number of our members now are from the PRS and are from councils as well as housing associations. We started off mainly focused on housing associations. And it's clear that there is a commonality of issues when it comes to service charges. So it doesn't matter if you are on quite what would be considered a reasonable wage, if your service charges are becoming unaffordable, the issue is the same for you. I guess where there is a distinction is between shared owners and leaseholders, as opposed to full renters. What you aren't going to get as a tenant, as a full tenant, you aren't forfeiting any property that you felt that you owned previously. So that would be the distinction. But otherwise, there is a commonality of the issues. The issues are the same. Access to justice is a huge problem. So when you know that your service charges are wrong, actually getting access to justice is hugely, hugely problematic. There is a massive enforcement gap. So even when the landlord acknowledges that your charges are wrong, actually getting any kind of enforcement of a refund is very, very difficult. And obviously, you know, the sanctions that either the tribunal or the housing ombudsman can apply, and it's mainly the tribunal system, because the housing ombudsman can't deal with the content of the service charges. They can only deal with how well any complaint was handled. But even then, the fines are laughably small, you know, compared to the incomes that these landlords have. So I don't think there is anything that is unique in that sense.
Okay.
Thank you. Is it back to you, Chair?
Are you happy to wrap up your other question?
Yeah, sure. My next question was, how common do you think unreasonable service charge costs are?
Well, I mean, we have people who are self-reporting. So in a way, we are seeing people when they've got a problem. But what I can say is that people will present to SHA with a wide range of problems, but overwhelmingly, the highest category is about either inaccurate or extortionate service charges. So either you know, the service charges are getting too high or that they are inaccurate. Is the biggest single issue. Probably unfair rents, the rents levels is kind of second to that, but absolutely highest, top of the list is the unfair service charges. So we think it is very, very common. Certainly out of the vast majority, 95% maybe, of the service charge accounts where people have sent us details and we've been able to look into them, they are riddled with inaccuracy. I mean, this isn't just somebody hasn't really put in enough, you know, one landlord or two landlords haven't put enough checks and balances in the system. This is a system that is being played by landlords. And the service charge accounts are absolutely riddled with inaccuracies.
And do you have any data on how much service charges have increased? And obviously you mentioned it a bit there, but in terms of the main drivers of the rise, do you think it's all purely just gaming the system?
We've done two reports. So the first report was really looking at the different forms that what we would call service charge abuse takes, and that is done in case studies, although there is some data in there which kind of quantifies as well. And we did a second report, which is a quantitative report, which is really on the impact on people, so affordability. So on there, we've seen the kind of hundreds, you know, we've plotted that some people have had hundreds, only a small percentage of tenants and residents, but for some people it's been hundreds of percentage points that their service charges have increased. The highest that we got reported in that was around 2,500, but that was in 2021, so they've gone up considerably since then. SHAC doesn't really have the resources to do the kind of wide scale academic standard of research. I think you would need a proper research body to do that. but you could get that information from landlords. I mean, landlords are getting, enough money from the public purse that certainly government could ask for that information in return. They could identify how high they are. That information is there. It's all collected by the landlords anyway.
Thank you very much. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you, Suze. Assembly Member Lord Bailey.
Hi, Suze. Social tenant. Oh, excuse me. Thank you. Sorry. How successful are social tenants in challenging unreasonable service charge costs?
Yeah. Again, I'm going to speak for all of us, not just social tenants, but it is very, very difficult for them. The only place that you can really go to, the only authority that you can go to. So I'll talk about the kind of establishment mechanisms, if you like, but then I'll come on to the mechanisms that they've got that aren't establishment ones. But the only establishment one that you've got is the first tier tribunal. And the first thing you've got to do if you want to go to tribunal is to try and get the information about what your service charges are, what the components of it are. Leaseholders and shared owners have at least a theoretical entitlement to the full statement and the invoice pack. So that's Section 21 and Section 22 of the Landlord and Tenant Act. But that doesn't apply to full renters. They don't even have the right to see what they are paying for, other than, they don't have a legal right. Obviously, the landlord might tell them anyway. So your first battle might be, especially if you are a renter, your first battle is actually to get the information of, they've sent me this massive bill. What does it all relate to? What are the invoices? And then you find your double and triplicate invoices in there. You find invoices for services that aren't provided to you. You find completely extortionate and inexplicable rises in charges. You find the things that previously were provided just as part of your rent, if you're a shared owner or a full renter, and were just part of the compliance if you were a leaseholder before. It's a bit like the move from BA, for example, into a low-budget airline, where you suddenly have to start paying for absolutely everything, including things like fire safety compliance, water hygiene compliance, that kind of thing, which has always been provided, but all of a sudden they've started charging you for it. So the list of items is growing. If you can get the information, you then have to go to court. Obviously, legal aid doesn't cover a lot of housing issues, and certainly I don't think covers any service charge, challenge. So you are going to go into court on your own, or if you can source free legal advice, then you might get free legal advice. But obviously, that it's hen's teeth, really, free legal advice on something like this. No win, no fee lawyers won't take it on because you can't ask for legal costs from the other side. Therefore, they generally can't make money out of service charge cases, and they won't take them on, which is why they're almost exclusively interested in disrepairs cases, the no win for no fee lawyers. What also happens is that the landlord will write to them the day before and tell them, or the day, just coming up to the court case, and tell them that what they're going to do is to ask the court, if they lose, if the tenant or resident loses, to cover their legal costs. And obviously, because they are turning up with a room full of barristers, a room full of solicitors, full-time paid legal staff from within their own department, those costs are going to be absolutely considerably higher than they are for the tenant or resident who's sitting alone on the other side of the court. So that's very intimidating. It's actually very, very rare. We haven't heard of a case of where, even when a tenant or resident has lost, that a judge has granted it, but we know of lots of cases where they've made that threat, and people have to take that into account. They can't just say, "Oh, it's very unlikely, therefore I'm not going to worry about it." They do worry about it, of course they do, because that could be hundreds of thousands of pounds. Sorry.
I know you're not a legal expert, and neither am I, so you might not be to answer this question. But in most of the British legal system, if you win, you can go for your costs. How comes it's different in this arena? What's the difference? Is this just historical, or is there a technical reason you know of?
That is way beyond beyond my
I'm just chancing my arm because it feels so different to the rest of our legal system. Yeah. Is another thing I'll be tabling a question about in the Lords.
Yeah. I think it's very different, actually, just on that. It's very different to our legal system, but it's also very different to every other area of retail, isn't it? Because if I go into a cafeteria, and order a cup of coffee and they try and charge me for a cup of coffee and 3 pizzas, I'm within my legal entitlement to walk out only having paid for that cup of coffee. But somehow this is reversed when it comes to items that are not just a few pounds, but a few £1,000s. I don't even have the same legal protections for those. So it is very, very different in the case of the landlord relationship over service charges.
Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Assembly Member Garbett, please.
Hello, Susan. Thanks for your answers so far. My question is specifically about the case of estate regeneration and the impact that has on specifically the service charge for social tenants. I understand that there are experiences of it increasing, and I didn't know if you could speak to that at all from cases that you're aware of.
Of regeneration?
Yeah, from estate regeneration, yeah.
And its relationship to service charges?
Yeah, service charge increases after estate regeneration.
Okay, well, I don't have any particular data on that. I mean, that's not an issue that's really been presented to us. I mean, we've had cases where people have tried to fight regeneration, but that usually results in people being in social cleansing and people being moved away. So we don't have a lot of data on what happens with service charges afterwards.
Okay, well, that's an answer in itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Suze. I do have one question which we put to the other panellists, and you really helpfully outlined that SHAC it extends beyond social tenants to include a whole range of other tenures and people that live in social housing, whether they're tenants or not. But I just wondered what happens in the case of somebody that SHAC would work with who can no longer afford their service charge. What support is available?
This was something. Thank you for that question. I mean, this was something that that I was going to outline actually, because there's obviously an access to justice. There's a gap there, but there's also in terms of enforcement, in terms of the way that the courts order it, and we do end up with can order a refund, but they can't actually force the landlord to do it, and there's no agency apparently that can force these landlords to do anything, even if they're housing associations and getting millions of pounds from government. What we will do, where people can't afford it or aren't willing to pay because they know the charge is wrong, what we will do is we will support people to withhold the payment as safely as possible. In fact, evictions in the housing association sector aren't massively high. They do happen, but they're not massively high. What ends up happening is that people get into deeper and deeper arrears, and there's very good, easily accessible data on the levels of arrears within housing associations. So it just builds up a whole load of arrears for that person. That obviously is a huge stress. It's a huge financial burden for them as well to be trying to pay off these arrears, but we will support them to withhold payment as safely as possible. And, in terms of kind of not going through the legal mechanism, that is the other option that is open to people. We believe that these kind of rent and service charge strikes are on the cards in a mass scale. We haven't seen it in a mass scale in Britain, and we haven't seen rent strikes for a long time in Britain. But I get the sense that this is coming down the road. People are getting to the end of their tether, and in the end, when it comes to a choice between do I feed my children or do I pay my service charge, our advice to the member would be feed your children. The landlords, and especially housing association landlords and private landlords, housing associations are sitting on £4.4 billion of surplus. That is a huge surplus, and would have been unfathomable to the founders of many of these housing associations. Why is all this money just sitting there, where after all the money has been paid? Probably some of it has come from illegitimate service charges. So they're not going to collapse if they don't get your £20 or £30 or £100 or whatever it is that you owe them. So we are supporting people to withhold payment, and that's what we would advise people to do, is to write to their landlord, copy in their MP, let them know why they're not doing it and what element they feel is illegitimate or extortionate.
Thank you so much, Suze. I have one final question for you, and then I'll ask you if there's anything else you'd like to cover. But we also put this to the other panellists. So Will SHAC stakeholders, the people that you work with, will they benefit in any way from transparency measures outlined in the Leasehold and Freehold Reform Act, in your opinion?
Not unless the enforcement gap is addressed. So, you know, if the legislation is already there, at least for leaseholders and shared owners, that should mean none of these problems exist, because the Landlord and Tenant Act already says that service charges have to be reasonable and reasonably incurred. There is already a requirement under Section 21 and Section 22 to share information with tenants and residents. The problem is that the landlords can ignore that with impunity. So you can put all the legislation, I mean, not you, but government can put all the legislation it wants in place. If it doesn't think about how that will be enforced and what meaningful sanctions can be applied with landlords who don't comply, then it's not going to make any difference. You need to have both pieces. You know, if people can't get access to justice, and even when they do, those courts can't actually enforce anything, then it's all going to be in vain. We spoke to a housing solicitor who told us that with housing associations, half of all of his cases are going back into court where the landlord has ignored a previous instruction from the courts, because they can pay the fine. Like I say, they're wealthy enough, they can pay the fine. Until we start seeing some of the affordable housing grant, for example, actually used, you know, linked to a sanction if landlords don't comply, if they are failing their tenants and residents on these measures, then it's not going to make any difference. And that's the only thing that is really going to count to them. Can they get the grant or can't they get the grant? Regulation itself, I used to work for the regulator. I worked for the regulator for nearly 20 years. It's a very soft form of regulation, which is really about maybe can we get the investors to worry, and then the investors will put pressure onto the landlords. That's not enough. That's not enough given what the landlords are doing.
Thank you for that response, Suze. That brings us to the end of our questions. So I want to thank you for joining us at the end of a busy day teaching. And for the rest of the Assembly, can we note the report, the committee, can we note the report in today's discussion? Can we also delegate authority to me as Chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from the discussion?
Agreed.
Can we agree the committee's work programme?
Agreed.
The date of the next meeting of the committee is the 21st of January 2025 at 10 a.m. here in the chamber at City Hall. I have no urgent business and I declare this meeting to be closed.
This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.